Chapter 937. Since they were leaving the pavilion, there was bound to be a farewell. Zheng Jing comforted his wife in his arms. His wife turned around from time to time and looked at Sang Sang in the pavilion with teary eyes. Sang Sang was still expressionless. She looked down at the tears left by Zheng Jing's wife on her clothes. The tears quickly disappeared, and no trace could be found. Ning Ke looked at the magnificent city in the distance and thought, how can there be a perfect way to live up to both Chang and Enqing? On a threshing ground in a village dozens of miles south of the city, the drunkard slowly put down his flagon and looked somewhere with mixed emotions. He was sad and confused. On the cliff plateau of Peach Mountain countless miles south of the city, the Abbey Dean sat in a wheelchair and looked at the blue sky outside the stone window. He sighed with emotion and said, "It seems that Haotian really needs our help." Long Qing asked, "What do we need to do?" The Abbey Dean said, "Haotian knows very well what we should do. What we need to do is to prepare her for the future and welcome her arrival." The city gate of Chang'an was closed, and there was no one around. It looked very lonely, but no one knew that at this moment, countless eyes were looking at the farewell pavilion in the south of the city. Sang Sang knew that many people were looking at her and waiting for her decision, but she did not care. She was Haotian, and no matter what she did not need to explain to human beings. The big black horse pulled the heavy black carriage consciously. Ning Ke walked into the carriage and found that the academy had prepared everything he needed. He took out something from a secret compartment and inserted it into the intersection of the talisman lines on the carriage wall. As a very faint light appeared, the talisman array on the wall of the carriage was instantly activated. The carriage made of iron and steel turned into a hair on the dust. When Sang Sang walked into the carriage, he was packing his luggage, the black arrow case, the black iron cutlass, the black umbrella, and the black carriage. It really looked like a world of night. The black carriage drove through the straight and spacious official road, past the tombs of Yin Sei and Wei Guangming, past the dry reeds that looked like wheat seedlings in spring, and came to the green meadow. Behind the green meadow was a towering mountain. In front of the mountain was a unique and elegant building. In front of the building was a newly repaired stone archway, from which came the sound of reading. "Do you want to go back to the academy?" Ning Ke looked at the familiar house and asked Sang Sang. Sang Sang didn't say anything and just shook her head. Suddenly, the sound of studying in the classroom of the academy stopped for some reason. Then, two extremely clear and distant sounds of flute and zither played harmoniously, as if they were welcoming a distinguished guest. Ning Ke walked out of the carriage and saw senior brothers Shiman and Beigong, who were holding zither and flutes, seventh sister, and the remaining senior brothers, Professor Huang He, and the female mathematics professor, who was still wearing a blue gown today. Somehow he felt his eyes moisten. Sang Sang sat in the carriage, quietly listening to the sounds of the zither and the flute. After a long time, she finally lifted the green curtain in front of the carriage and came to the meadow among the flowers and trees. Many students of the academy ran out and looked curiously and confusedly at the black carriage on the meadow, wondering who it was. It actually alarmed the entire academy. These ordinary students in the front yard were newly recruited this year. Ning Ke didn't know any of them, and no one knew him. He said to fourth brother, "I hope they can live longer." In the war against the Tang Empire 2 years ago, all the students of the academy, whether they were in the army or serving as officials in the harsh border commandery, suffered heavy casualties. He took Sang Sang to walk in the human world and endured endless pain and torture without giving up. Naturally, he didn't want such a thing to happen again. Fourth brother looked at him and said, "That depends on you, youngest brother." Ning Ke said, "Please rest assured, senior brother. I will try my best." Fourth brother nodded with relief, and then turned to look at Sang Sang among the flowers and trees. He bowed deeply to the ground, and the disciples and instructors of the academy at the back of the mountain of the academy also bowed deeply to him. Although they were hostile to Haotian Taoism, most of the Tangs were believers of Haotian. Therefore, no matter where Sang Sang went, as long as they knew her identity, they would definitely bow to her and wish they could be as low as the dust. After all, the academy was the academy. It was natural for them to bow to Haotian. But they wouldn't kneel because they used to live with her, and because Haotian was their enemy. When they bowed, they naturally couldn't play the zither or flute. The music had already stopped. Shimin Weiyang held the zither in his arms. When he straightened up, his eyes were already red. He stared at Sang Sang among the flowers and finally shed tears. He said, "Why are you still alive?" Sang Sang was still expressionless. She said, "I will never die." At this time, seventh sister had already spread the flower cloth on the meadow and was putting the prepared food on the cloth. Hearing this, she hurriedly said, "Let's eat first." They have to continue their journey. Just like in the shabby alley of Linkhong City in the South Jin Kingdom, people who had lived in the academy would always think that eating was more important than anything, even if it was Haotian. Interestingly, Sang Sang still seemed to have the habit of living in the back of the mountain of the academy. Although she didn't say anything, she accepted Mu Yu's words and sat down beside the flower cloth. Shimin Weiyang wiped away the tears on his face and sat by her side. Picking up a pair of chopsticks, he placed all of the vinegar-soaked cabbage heads into his own bowl. Then he continuously sent them into his mouth. Only when his cheeks were bulging did he remember that he should chew them a bit. He chewed hard, and the cabbage heads and vinegar made a crunching sound between his teeth. It was unknown whether it was too sour or something else, but he frowned and seemed to be in pain. Sang Sang was a little unhappy, which made Shimin Weiyang happy. He didn't care whether you were Haotian or not. As long as you thought about it, you would turn into ashes. Anyway, you wouldn't be able to eat happily today. The farewell meal was not the last meal, so there was no need to eat miserably. However, it was impossible to eat happily in such a situation. If it weren't for the fear that they would never see Ning Ke again, people in the back of the mountain of the academy wouldn't have invited Sang Sang to dinner. It was quite possible that they would treat her to a few cuts. The picnic among the grass and flowers soon ended. Sang Sang returned to the horse carriage, and the onlookers gradually dispersed. Ning Ke finished talking with his senior brothers and sisters, and was about to leave. However, seventh sister Mu Yu pulled him aside and whispered something to him. Ning Ke couldn't help but frown when he heard what she said. "Which direction are we going?" he asked Sang Sang when he entered the carriage. Sang Sang said, "To the west." After a moment of silence, Ning Ke asked, "Why does everyone have to go to the west?" Sang Sang said, "Has Junimo gone there?" Ning Ke said, "Second brother is going to cultivate Buddhism. Why are you going to Xiankong Temple?" Sang Sang didn't explain. Ning Ke thought of the lament he felt when he looked at Chang'an City from afar. He vaguely felt that everything was destined. How could there be a perfect law in the world? Could it be Buddhism? The iron wheel rolled on the stone path among the meadows silently. The black horse carriage went to the west, as if it wanted to go back in time. Just as Ning Ke and Sang Sang set off, someone had already arrived in the west. In the extreme west of the wilderness, there was a boundless cliff. The cliff led to the bottom of the earth. It was extremely steep, spanning many miles. In the middle of the cliff was an extremely deep sinkhole, and at the bottom of the sinkhole was an extremely vast field. In the middle of the field was an extremely majestic mountain. If this mountain was on the ground, it might be higher than Tianqi Peak. However, because it was located in the sinkhole, one could only see the verdant peak from the ground. There were countless ancient trees on the giant peak, giving it a dense green. Hidden among the trees were countless yellow temples and Buddhist halls. These temples and Buddhist halls together formed the unknown place of Buddhism, Xiankong Temple. The drunkard stood on the edge of the cliff and looked at the giant peak in the distance. He looked at the peak that was parallel to his line of sight. After a long silence, the expression on his face gradually became cold. In terms of cultivation time, the Buddha was later than the drunkard and the butcher. However, in terms of the foundation he established in the human world and the state he reached, the Buddha was far better than the drunkard. As the Abbey Dean said, the drunkard and the butcher cultivated their desires, and they had cultivated to the extreme of human beings. But the Buddha cultivated himself, and when he reached nirvana, he had already surpassed human beings. When the Buddha was still preaching, the drunkard had never been to Xiankong Temple. After the Buddha reached nirvana, he had visited twice, but he had never entered. just like he had never entered the divine halls of West Hill. He had always felt a little uneasy, looking at the yellow temples and halls among the peaks. The uneasiness in his heart became heavier and heavier. He vaguely felt that the Abbey Dean's thought had revealed an unimaginable truth. A clear and distant bell suddenly rang in a temple among the giant peaks. The bell rang through the forest and swept over the eaves. It took a long time for the bell to reach the wilderness beside the giant sinkhole, and into his ears. There were 2 roads from Chang'an to the western wilderness. One was to go straight west, cross the Pamir Mountains, enter the Ueluan Mountains, and then go straight up to the western wilderness. The other one was to go north to the wilderness, and then go straight west. Sang Sang said to go west, but did not say how. So Ning Ke chose to go north first, because there were many familiar sceneries and things along the way. He thought she would be touched. They went all the way north. The black horse carriage passed through Hebei County and went straight to Min Mountain. They passed by the road where he found her, and the forest where the old hunter used to live, but her expression did not change at all. Ning Ke was not disappointed. He believed that one day, Sang Sang would be touched by the memories, and her humanity would triumph over divinity, and she would become a real human being. At that time, he would be able to sing with her. Of course, they would not sing Black Pig, but the poem that was used to kill people. Ning Ke kept this optimistic thought, or hope, until the horse carriage passed through the northern mountain road and came to the familiar earthen city. Then he realized that everything had changed. Please allow me to wish Miss Doba happy wedding, and today. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 938. It was late spring in the Central Plains, but the northern frontier fortress did not feel cold at all. Instead, it began to heat up earlier. The weather in recent years was as unpredictable as Haotian's mood. Along with the heat came the dryness. The border of the wilderness had always had little rain, and now it was even more dusty. Although the grass in the wilderness was stubbornly green, it was covered in dust and looked very ugly. It was even more so in the city of Wei. The mud walls were scratched by the northwest wind, and dust was flying everywhere. If it were in the past, the muddy veterans would be cursing on the shabby barracks, and the General Ma would be sighing at the muddy wine in his bowl. Now the dust was still flying, but those scenes could no longer be seen. There were traces of the war 2 years ago in the corners of the walls. The wind could cut the mud walls, but it could not erase the old black blood stains. The slightly astringent well had been filled with sand by the barbarians, and the shabby barracks had long collapsed. The dilapidated and abandoned town was uninhabitable, and there was no one in it. There was no one in the city of Wei, but there were people outside the city. Dozens of tents stood firm in the wind and sand. From time to time, prayers and incantations could be heard. The barbarians who were used to living in the wild seemed to be living happily. Although he was exposed to the scorching sun and strong wind, Ning Ke's face became paler and paler. He looked at the dead city in silence, and no one knew what he was thinking. Sang Sang's spirit was much better than before. She sat by the window, looking at the tents, and feeling the pure spiritual power from the heart. She looked calm. After years of unremitting efforts of Haotian Taoism, the most powerful force in the wilderness, the Golden Tribe Royal Court, finally changed its original faith and bowed down to the divine light of Haotian. They worshipped the everlasting heaven, which was also Haotian, and also Sang Sang. The wind outside the city of Wei gradually stopped. A cloud floated in from nowhere and blocked the scorching sun. The wind from the depths of the wilderness also became much cooler. The barbarians walked out of their tents and enjoyed the rare comfort. Their faces were filled with cheerful smiles. Some pious elders kissed the ground and thanked Haotian for the blessing. Ning Ke looked back at Sang Sang and asked, "Your cloud?" Sang Sang did not answer him. She lifted the green curtain and got out of the carriage. She walked slowly in the tent, feeling the respect and love of the barbarians. Her eyebrows gradually relaxed, and the flowers on her green dress gradually bloomed. After leaving the West Hill Divine Palace, she had been to the Great River and the Lank Temple, as well as the South Jin Kingdom and the Tang Empire. She had never felt like this in those places. Only now did she feel like she was walking in her own world. The sun gradually set in the west, and the temperature became more and more pleasant. More and more barbarians came out of their tents. The women began to prepare dinner, and the men began to pile firewood for the night bonfire. It was very lively. No one could see Sang Sang and him. The barbarians around the tent suddenly cheered. Ning Kai turned around and saw a black herd of horses coming from the south of the city of Wei, driven by dozens of cavalrymen of the Golden Tribe. Looking at this scene, the emotions on his face became somewhat complicated. Those horses were not wild horses, but the handsome war horses that the Tang Empire raised in the Xiangwan Plain. In the peace treaty signed by him, the Xiangwan Plain and the 7 stockade villages were all ceded to the Golden Tribe royal court. The Tang Empire had fewer war horses, and it was difficult to replenish them. According to the plan of the West Hill Divine Palace, the Tang army would run out of war horses in another 3 years. Even if the war started again, the Tang Empire would definitely lose. In other words, from the day the Tang Empire ceded the Xiangwan Plain, there was no way for the Tang Empire to make a comeback. There were 1,000 horses outside the city of Wei, which was the last batch of trophies harvested by the royal court. Naturally, the barbarians were in high spirits. The bonfire in the tents was suddenly enlarged, and the number of slaughtered sheep doubled. Some nobles even ordered their slaves to carry out countless jars of wine, which led to an even louder cheer. As the night approached, the bonfire was lit. All the barbarians came out of their tents and began to eat and drink around the bonfire. When they were drunk, they began to wrestle and play, and young men and women began to dance enthusiastically. Ning Kai stood outside and looked at the scene calmly. In fact, it took him a lot of effort to control himself from looking at the ruins of the city of Wei. The livelier the barbarian tribe was, the more deserted the earthen city was. The happier the barbarians were, the sadder the earthen city was. The brighter the bonfire was, the angrier the earthen city was. The big black horse sensed his mood and slowly lowered its head. At this time, Sang Sang had finished her tour of her world and walked back to the horse carriage. She looked at him and asked, "Are you very angry?" Ning Kai calmly said, "Yes, I am very angry." Sang Sang asked, "Why?" Ning Kai did not look at her and said, "This is a human emotion. It has nothing to do with you." Sang Sang said, "Although I am not a human, I can analyze this kind of emotion." Ning Kai said, "You won't understand." Sang Sang said, "Then you have to tell me." Ning Kai said, "I am angry because of these barbarians, but I am more angry because you are not angry. This makes me very sad and disappointed, and I even start to doubt my own thoughts." Sang Sang said, "Why should I be angry?" Ning Kai turned to look at her for a long time and said in a slightly cold voice, "You have lived here before." Sang Sang's expression did not change. She said, "I have lived in many places." Ning Kai stared at her eyes and said, "The people in the city of Wei used to love you so much." Sang Sang looked at the deserted earthen city in the night and was silent for a while. Then she pointed to the barbarians who were celebrating around the bonfire and said, "These people also love me very much." Ning Kai suppressed his anger and said, "How can it be the same?" Sang Sang said calmly, "They are all my people. I treat them the same." Ning Kai could no longer control his emotions and shouted angrily, "If you have not become an idiot, then you should be very clear that these people in the city of Wei died because of you." Sang Sang's expression still did not change, and the emotion in her voice was still so calm, or it could be said that there was no emotion at all. She said coldly, "Except this time? For countless years, human beings have long been used to killing each other in my name. Do I have to be responsible for every time?" Ning Kai looked at her eyes and said, "You also know, except this time." After saying this, he did not continue. He silently walked to the horse carriage and waved the horsewhip in the air. The whip was loud and clear, dispersing the cool night wind and the light from the bonfire. The horse carriage just drove past the tents and stopped again. Tonight, the moon was curved like a hook and was not bright. The night sky was dotted with stars. The starlight sprinkled on the wilderness, slightly illuminating the dark wilderness, and a huge stone pile. There were dozens of wooden shelves in the stone pile. On the shelves were rotten corpses that had been dried by the wind. From the tattered clothes, it could be recognized that these dead people were all Tang soldiers. Ningke did not know whether this was the Golden Tribe royal court showing off after the war, or the extremely cruel torture of the scouts, sent by the Tang army, to the wilderness last year after being caught. His face was very calm, as if there was frost on it. With a clang, he unsheathed the iron cutlass, and chopped at the stone pile from a distance of dozens of feet. The iron cutlass cut the wind silently, but one could faintly hear the fierce cry of a vermilion bird. With a bang, the stone pile was broken into 2 pieces. A raging flame shot out from the edge of the cutlass, and fell on the stone pile. In an instant, the wooden shelves and the corpses of the Tang soldiers on the shelves were all burned into the cleanest ashes. Ningke put the cutlass back into the sheath. The horse carriage continued to move forward. He did not sit in the carriage, but sat on the shaft, listening to the friction between the wheels and the weeds. He looked at the night in silence. After a long time, Song Song's voice sounded in the carriage. I thought you would kill all the humans outside the city of Wei, or slowly roast them to death. Ningke did not look back and asked emotionlessly, Will you stop me? Sang Sang said, I don't know. Ningke said sarcastically, Is there something that Haoyan doesn't know? Sang Sang said, Because there are some things that I suddenly don't want to calculate. Ningke gradually calmed down, and even smiled as he thought of those valiant grassland men, and those beautiful girls whose cheeks were roasted by the bonfire. I said it in the imperial palace of Chang, and in Qinghe Prefecture, and in many other places. These people will all die. None of them will be left. So I am not in a hurry. The carnival around the bonfire, the dancing young men and women, the pious old men, and the ignorant teenagers who could already ride horses. If such a beautiful scene was destroyed, what kind of beauty would it be? Song Song's voice was a little cold. Do you think I will allow it? Ningke said, So I will defeat you first and then kill them all. This journey was backtracking. One part of it was from the Lank Temple to Chang'an, and another part was from the city of Wei to the west. The same 2 people, the same black horse, and the same black carriage. However, in those years, the sky was full of clouds and crows. Today it was so quiet. After leaving the city of Wei, Ningke became much quieter. He talked less and less with Sang Sang, and the time he spent staring at the green grassland became longer and longer. When passing by Shibi Lake, according to his original plan, he would definitely rest here for a night, and let Sang Sang relive some of the past. However, he suddenly changed his mind, and continued to move through the night. Sang Sang understood his emotional problem, but she did not care. At least Ningke could not see that she did not care. Moreover, what she had to consider was indeed more important. Haoyan could calculate everything in the world. She calculated that there would be a very satisfactory result of this trip. However, when she was thinking about the green grassland, she once again confirmed that there was something she could not calculate. Because she could not calculate it, she had to see it with her own eyes. After seeing the world that belonged to her, she wanted to see people or things beyond the world, and then she left. There is still 1 chapter left today. I have to walk the dog now, so the update time may be late. Those who have to work or go to school tomorrow don't wait. You can read it tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 939. Ningke was silent because of the negative emotions of disappointment and anger. Sang Sang, who rarely spoke, was even quieter now. That was because they had left the barbarian settlement. The vast and desolate scenery was devoid of human habitation. The further they were from the human world, the further they were from the human world. The only difference was that they were far from the human world. They crossed the wilderness along the route they had taken before. When summer came, the black horse carriage also came to the edge of the swamp called Quagmire. The smell of wet rot and fog appeared in front of Ningquebec. If it was in the past, he would naturally feel that there were many dangers hidden in the fog of the swamp. But now he did not care at all, because Haoyan was in the carriage, and because he knew who the master of the swamp was. The black horse carriage entered the fog, and the carriage emitted warm light. The light came from Song Song's body. It was not hot and dazzling but extremely tough. No matter how wet and heavy the fog was, it could not stop the light from spreading endlessly. In just a moment, the fog around the horse carriage was swept away by the light, revealing the blue sky above and the true appearance of the swamp. There was mud everywhere, and the seemingly shallow water was covered with greasy green moss. No one knew how many terrible pools were hidden below, and it was impossible for ordinary people to walk out alive. It was not difficult for Ning Kai and Sang Sang. The black horse carriage was as light as a feather, and the wheels rolled over the water without leaving any marks, not even the moss. The sinister flood dragons in the pool and the strange beasts lurking in the water were peeping at their carriage from afar. Because of their lack of intelligence, they could not feel the power of Haotian, but they were instinctively afraid and did not dare to come close to provoke them. But the big black horse was still vigilant, for it did not want to be bitten. Ning Kai's iron cutlass suddenly became hot, and a bright red flame flowed out of the scabbard. It turned into a dark red vermilion bird in the air in front of the carriage, howling at a direction in the distant fog. The vermilion bird was the killing talisman of the god-stunning array. What could wake it up was naturally not the flood dragons or strange beasts, but a stronger enemy. It kept howling at the distant fog, looking extremely nervous. After entering the swamp, it was safe and sound. Ning Kai felt like a fox exploiting the tiger's might. At this time, when he saw the vermilion bird's intense reaction, he could not help but feel a little nervous and vigilant. Sang Sang was not nervous. She only felt that the vermilion bird's cry was a bit unpleasant and harsh. She reached out through the blue curtain and held its neck in the slightly stuffy wind. Then the cry stopped abruptly. The vermilion bird was a divine talisman at the peak of the knowing destiny state. Especially after it broke through its fear in the Battle of Chong and then attacked the Aberdeen, it became even more proud and confident. It would never be willing to bear such pressure. However, it did not dare to struggle in her hand. Its two eyes rolled around looking very pitiful. The sound of hoofbeats could be faintly heard from the fog in the distance. After a very short period of time, the sound of hoofbeats quickly became clearer. It was as violent as rain, and the entire swamp began to shake uneasily. Ning Kai had been vigilantly looking in that direction. When he heard the violent hoofbeats, he suddenly relaxed, because he already knew who it was. Without the cover of the fog, everything in the swamp could be seen very clearly. When the fog in the distance was dispersed by the black shadow, what followed the dense sound of hoofbeats was an endless herd of wild horses. At the front of the herd, there were 8 rare horses pulling an extremely old carriage. The 8 horses were pulling an extremely shabby carriage, and in the old carriage sat a dark-skinned lazy donkey with snow-white lips. Gaga was here. With its lazy temperament, its king's carriage should be at the back of the herd of wild horses, and it should be lying on its back with its 4 hooves facing the sky. And with its gluttonous habit of the academy, it should be chewing the yellow fruits beside it, and not caring about what was happening between heaven and earth. But today Gaga was very different. It did not even look at the basket of fruits on the shabby carriage. Its front hooves had already broken the dead wood in front of the carriage. Its eyes were red, and it was full of murderous intent as it rushed over with the herd of wild horses. Sang Sang lifted the curtain of the carriage and stood in front of the carriage expressionlessly, looking at the horrifying herd of wild horses. Her flowery indigo dress swayed in the wind, and she reached out to catch a gust of wind from the sky. Then she waved her hand, and the clouds in the blue sky were not disturbed. The wind raged in the swamp, and the stagnant water in the pond splashed around like a rainstorm, and countless mosses flew all over the sky. When the herd of wild horses suddenly encountered the power of heaven and earth, no matter how obedient they could not help but be in a mess. And the 8 horses at the front were directly blown into the mud by the gust of wind, and they were covered with mud. The shabby carriage fell on the ground and broke into countless pieces. The basket of yellow fruits was shaken into a mixture of juice and flock, and the black donkey was shaken into the sky. Gaga! Gaga! An angry and manic cry came from the sky to the earth. The black shadow quickly became smaller, and the furious black donkey fell from the sky, breaking through the air and stepping on Song Song's head. Sang Sang looked up at the sky, and then she reached out her right hand again. She felt that the vermilion bird's cry was too unpleasant, so she reached out and grabbed its neck to stop the cry. She also felt that the donkey's cry was unpleasant, so she prepared to do what she did before. The black donkey had lived like a prince in the swamp wilderness for many years, so it was naturally a little round. Its neck was very strong and thick. Logically speaking, it should not have been able to be caught with one hand. Moreover, it was coming down from a high altitude, and its terrifying front hooves were ready to strike. How could she catch its neck first? To Sang Sang, there were not so many whys and explanations. She could do what she wanted to do. She could pluck a white cloud from the sky, catch a gust of wind, and then she could definitely catch a black donkey. She grabbed the black donkey's neck and lifted it in the air in front of her. No matter how angry the donkey was, it could not make a sound. It could only stare at her, and kept kicking its four hooves, looking a little funny. You can't beat her. Forget it. Ning Ke looked at the black donkey and tried to persuade it. He knew why the Gaga was so angry. As the youngest uncle, how could the black donkey have any good impression of Haotian? The black donkey had followed Kaharan around the world, and developed a lonely, irascible and arrogant temper. It was not comparable to Ning Ke's shameless big black horse. Naturally, it refused to listen to him, and kept kicking its hooves. It thought to itself that it would leave a hoof mark on the face of this little B***tch today, even if it had to risk its life. It did not know what a little B***tch meant, only that it was a dirty word. No matter how arrogant it was, it could only give up in the face of absolute strength. As the king of the swamp, the Gaga was still helpless in front of Haotian. Although it had inherited the pride of the youngest uncle, it did not forget the basic style of the academy. If it could not win, then it would not fight for the time being. It would wait until it could win. Countless wild horses occupied the surface of the swamp. They had never seen the sun and the blue sky in the swamp, so they all looked up curiously and motionlessly, which was particularly interesting. Only the black donkey knew that the wild horses did not dare to see its pitiful appearance, so it was somewhat satisfied. When Ning Ke fed it the powdery juice in the basket, it was even more satisfied. It thought that it had not realized that there was such a wonderful way to eat the fruit today. It had really wasted its life in the past few years. Ning Ke barely repaired the broken carriage, and then walked to the front of the donkey. He took out the ointment from his arms, and smeared it on the bald fur. After that, he whispered a few words to the Gaga, who nodded indifferently. Then a happy smile appeared on his face. When he returned to the carriage, he met Song Song's eyes. From her clear and bright eyes, he knew that she had seen through his plan. But he did not care, because she would definitely know. Those arrangements were originally for the future, and everything must be based on the premise that he could defeat her. Sitting in the broken carriage, the Gaga led the countless wild horses to the fog on the other side of the swamp. It could not avenge its master, but it had tried its best and should have no regrets. But why did the old black donkey on the carriage make people feel so sad? Looking at the dust left by the wild horses, and the touching donkey in the dust, Ning Ke was silent for a long time. Then he asked, what kind of person was youngest uncle? Youngest uncle Kaharan was a legend in the back mountain of the academy, and also in the human world. Ning Ke inherited his mantle, but did not know him very well, although he had heard many stories. Why did he pull out his sword to the sky? How did he leave the human world? What was he thinking at that moment? What on earth happened in the wilderness at that time? This was a secret that no one knew, not even the headmaster of the academy. Only the dead youngest uncle and Haotian knew, but now Haotian was beside him, so Ning Ke wanted to know. After a moment of silence, Sang Sang said, he was a madman. Ko Haoran was called Madman Ko by the world, and even Haotian thought that he was a madman. If one thought about it carefully, he would probably understand that this was the greatest glory and pride of a human being. After leaving the swamp, they entered the West Wilderness. Ning Ke and Sang Sang went all the way to the west. They did not hurry, so when the black carriage reached the depths of the West Wilderness, it was already autumn. Autumn in the wilderness was not as clear as that in the Central Plains. It had a kind of bleak beauty, but it was cold and chilling. Soon after the morning wind stopped, It began to snow. There were some undulating hills in the wilderness. Beside one of the hills, there was a withered tree that had died a long time ago. The branches wrapped in snow and frost looked like jade carvings carved by skilled craftsmen. They trembled in the wind and snow, as if they were nodding slowly to express their gratitude to their old friends who came to visit. Ning Ke and Sang Sang got out of the carriage and came to the dead tree. The branches suddenly trembled more violently, and the snow and frost on them fell off. Then the ground in front of the tree, which had been frozen solid by the low temperature, cracked, revealing a hole. He lowered his head to pick up the things in the hole, and then walked back to the carriage. Sang Sang also walked back. The cracked ground in front of the withered tree suddenly closed, and the snow and frost covered the branches again. Everything returned to its original state. Today's 3 chapters count as Monday's consolation. Everyone knows that I haven't asked for votes for dozens of days, and I also said that I don't want votes. But today, I was taught a lesson by the deputy editor. I forgot the relationship between recommendation votes and the number of essence votes, and I'm really sorry that it affected their hard work. Please give me more recommendation votes. Jiangyi really needs it now. Thank you. See you tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to give me recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 940. The Black Horse carriage continued to the west. In the carriage, Ning Ke carefully straightened the black cloth, and then looked at the chessboard and asked, "Why did you come here?" Sang Sang said, "I want to confirm something." The chessboard was made of some unknown material. It looked like iron and was cold and hard, but when Ning Ke knocked on it with his fingers it made no sound. The chessboard that Buddha left to the human world was naturally extraordinary. Ning Ke looked at the chessboard and asked after a moment of silence, "What is it? Does it have something to do with Buddha?" Sang Sang said, "Yes, I want to know whether he is dead or alive." Ning Ke was shocked and speechless. He had thought that Sang Sang wanted to find a way to return to the divine kingdom through the esoteric Buddhism in Xiankong Temple, and even guessed that she might want to destroy Xiankong Temple. But he never thought that she wanted to confirm whether Buddha was dead or alive. Did it mean that Buddha was still alive? I don't understand. Didn't Buddha attain nirvana a long time ago? When we were in Lank Temple, I told you that he was dead, but still alive. Ning Ke remembered that day on the top of Tile Mountain, when she looked at the stone statue of Buddha that was no longer there in the spring rain. She suddenly felt something, and said that Buddha was the cat with the surname Shui. At that time, he felt very strange, and did not think deeply about it. But he did not expect that she really thought that Buddha might still be alive, and came to the West Wilderness for this reason. Ning Ke was very confused. Buddha had attained nirvana. How could he still be alive? What is nirvana? Sang Sang asked. Ning Ke was slightly startled and said, "Nirvana is the highest state of Buddhism," Sang Sang said expressionlessly. "If nirvana means death, why not just call it death?" The question was very simple and even unreasonable. But Ning Ke could not answer it, because he was very clear that her question had actually explained the problem. Sang Sang looked out of the window at the snowy wilderness and said, "Just like your teacher, Buddha also thought about how to defeat me. He wanted to use his wisdom to understand me, but he could not do it. So he wanted to see through cause and effect, and then jump out of it. If he could survive time, he could survive me. But who can really jump out of cause and effect and surpass time?" Ning Ke said, "So?" Sang Sang said, "The Buddha hid himself so that I couldn't find him. When the time comes, he will wake up." The so-called fated chance was hard to describe. Perhaps it was when she returned to the divine kingdom, or when she found it difficult to leave the human world, and became weaker day by day. A mighty person like the Gautama Buddha must have his own plan. Ning Ke understood a little, but he was more confused. Haotian was omnipotent and omniscient. How could he not know the life and death of the Buddha? Even the headmaster of the academy could not completely avoid Haotian's eyes. It was just that he had merged with the human world, so Haotian could not identify his original body. "I am indeed omniscient," Sang Sang said. "That's why I don't understand. That's why I want to see. If the Buddha is still alive, I'll kill him. Then I'll know whether he's dead or alive. I don't know if Buddha is dead or alive, so I'll find you. If you're dead, then it's fine. If you're still alive, then I'll kill you. Then your life and death will be determined. What a domineering declaration. Only she had the right to say such things. Ning Ke suddenly felt that he could only be a family man in front of such a wife. So he consciously picked up the black cloth and began to sew the big black umbrella. Just like that autumn, Ning Ke and Sang Sang came to the western wilderness from the Lank Temple. But they came through the Buddha's chessboard. Now the Buddha's chessboard was in their hands. In the desolate wilderness, there was a lonely tree. Its trunk was gray, and its leaves were like futons green in the light snow. It was the Bodhi tree. There were several traces of depression under the Bodhi tree. The inside was as smooth as a mirror, very clean. There were no leaves, dust, or snowflakes. There was nothing inside. The Buddha was lying on his side under the Bodhi tree, closing his eyes to attain nirvana. These were the last traces he left in the human world. The black horse carriage stopped in front of the Bodhi tree. Ning Ke and Sang Sang got off. There was an old monk under the Bodhi tree. The old monk wore a bamboo hat and held a monk's staff. His body seemed to be tightly connected with the desolate and boundless earth. He was as heavy as a mountain, but actually as smooth as a plain. Even the strong wind could not shake him. The old monk was not the Buddha, but the current Buddha in the human world, the chief preaching monk of the Xiankong Temple. It had been several autumns since they parted in Chaoyang City. The chief monk was one of the most powerful people Ning Ke had ever seen in his life. Below the headmaster of academy were the abbey dean and him. At this moment, seeing the chief monk sitting under the Bodhi tree, Ning Ke could not help but feel nervous. The chief preaching monk did not look at Ning Ke, but at Sang Sang beside him. The emotions in his eyes were very complicated. There was pity, sympathy, and most of all determination. Sang Sang wanted to go to the Bodhi tree to see the traces left by Buddha's nirvana. The chief monk was sitting under the Bodhi tree. If he didn't give way, how could he see him? Even if eldest brother and second brother joined hands in their heyday, they might not be able to defeat the chief monk of scripture. Ning Ke had never thought that he could cross this mountain range by himself. Yes, the chief preaching monk was an invisible but majestic mountain range on the earth. His feet seemed to be in the wilderness, and the staff in his hand was the giant tree in the mountain range. "Senior, please make way," Ning Ke said. The chief monk looked at him quietly and asked, "Why should I give way?" Ning Ke said, "We want to see the Bodhi tree." The chief monk sighed and said, "The Bodhi is not a tree." Ning Ke said, "We are not monks. We don't need to be witty." The chief monk said, "Even if the Bodhi is a tree, it is the tree of Xiankong Temple." Sang Sang suddenly said, "Is the name of Xiankong Temple carved on the tree?" This sentence was so unreasonable, like a naughty child talking about a toy. The chief monk of scripture did not expect that Haoyan would say such a thing, and he could not help but be stunned. The chief monk of scripture of Xiankong Temple was the top figure in the cultivation world. But in Song Song's eyes he was just a mortal. Even if he was connected with the wilderness, he was just a clumsy stone. Sang Sang walked to the Bodhi tree. Ning Ke became nervous. After Lu Bai entered the Peach Mountain with his sword, this was the dialogue between Haoyan and the most powerful human being. The chief monk slowly closed his eyes and did not look at her, who was walking under the tree. He sat under the tree, which was a mountain range. Its roots were deeply rooted in the earth's crust, and its peak was so high that it reached the sky. Even if Haoyan came to the human world, how could he surpass it? Sang Sang walked to the Bodhi tree and walked to the chief monk. Her feet landed on the chief monk's knees. The chief monk's body was not so tall, and he was even a little thin, but she was so tall and plump. She walked to the chief monk, like a white elephant about to climb the delicate rockery in the garden. This scene looked a little weird and incomprehensible. After her feet landed on the chief monk's body, the rockery became a real mountain range. This mountain range was extremely majestic. She did not care about it and continued to climb. Her left foot landed on the chief monk's shoulder. No matter how high the mountain range was, she only needed to take 3 steps to reach the top. The blue embroidered shoes touched the bamboo hat. The earth was shaking, and the clouds were flying in the sky. She stood on the head of the chief monk, looking at the Bodhi tree in front of her, and the Xiankong temple in the distance with her hands behind her back. It was like looking at the scenery from the peak. It was a miraculous scene. For Sang Sang, there was no mountain range in the human world that she could not surpass. Even if this mountain range was so majestic, and its peak was almost touching the sky, there was still a little distance between it and the sky. Even if this mountain range was connected to the wilderness, and there was endless thick soil below it, she could still suppress it. She used the power of the sky to suppress the earth. The earth was still shaking, and it became more and more violent. The blue Bodhi tree did not fall, but its futon-like leaves fell all over the ground. The body of the chief monk also began to shake violently. His kasaya was broken into countless butterflies and scattered in all directions. His pale body was glowing with a faint white luster, like a statue. Ning Ke looked at the scene under the tree, and was shocked speechless. He remembered that in Chaoyang City, neither the primordial 13 arrows, nor the iron cutlass, could leave a trace on the body of the chief monk. The chief monk had cultivated his body to the level of Buddha. Both his body and mind were indestructible. At this moment, it seemed that even if the sky was pressing down on him, he could still hold on. Sang Sang stood on the head of the chief monk with her hands behind her back, looking indifferent. She did not care how long the old monk under her feet could hold on. She just wanted to see the tree. The earth continued to shake violently. Countless black cracks appeared on the barren wilderness, and red magma even spilled out in the distance. Song Song's cyan dress with flowers fluttered in the wind and the thin snow. She slowly fell down. The chief monk of scripture under her feet slowly sank into the earth, squeezing out countless black mud, and making a teeth-aching grinding sound, and the sound of rocks breaking. It did not take long for the chief monk of scripture to completely sink into the earth, leaving only his head above the ground. 2 wisps of white eyebrows floated in the smoke and dust, looking extremely gloomy. As long as one did not leave the earth, he would be indestructible. This was the supreme dharma cultivated by the chief monk of scripture. Even if the abbey dean regained his state, he would not be able to do anything to him. Song Song's method was very simple. She directly let him become one with the earth. The chief monk of scripture's head was on the ground with his eyes closed. Sang Sang walked down from his head. It was only a short stone step. She did not look back at the most powerful Buddhist sect. She walked to the Bodhi tree with her hands behind her back. She had told the chief monk that the name of Xiankong Temple was not carved on the Bodhi tree. So the tree did not belong to Xiankong Temple. In fact, the Bodhi tree was carved with her name, so it was hers. That autumn, she and Ning Ke escaped from the Lank Temple and came here. At that time, they were chased by the world and were depressed. Ning Ke took her to see the remains of Buddha, and then he carved a line of words under the Bodhi tree. In the autumn of the 16th year of Tianqi era, Ning Ke of the academy came here with his wife Sang Sang, the daughter of Yama. After seeing the traces of Buddha's nirvana under the Bodhi tree, she left the Bodhi tree with her hands behind her back, and walked to the distant peak that was level with the ground. The Xiankong temple was in the middle of the peak. Ning Ke looked at the line of words on the Bodhi tree and smiled. He looked at the head of the chief monk of scripture on the ground and sighed. Then he drove the carriage to chase her tall figure in the field. First of all, thank you for your votes. Please continue to teach me and vote. Thank you very much. Next, it's hard to sustain the pace of 10,000 votes a day. It's not our style, isn't it? So that's it for today. I'll sort out the following plot, and have a big explosion tomorrow. I'm used to this kind of neurotic pace. Anyway, I don't need the monthly votes. I can do whatever I want as long as the total is not small. Ha 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 ha. I'm happy just thinking about it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 941. Coming to the cliff, Ning Ke looked at the giant peak of the giant sinkhole, and the temple between the peaks in silence. This was the second time he had seen the true face of Xiankong Temple, but he was still shocked. The cliff was very steep, and it suddenly sank from the surface of the wilderness, which was quite shocking. Ning Ke left the big black horse and the carriage on the ground and followed Sang Sang down. He and Sang Sang had been here before, but they turned away after a glance from a distance, not daring to go down. The situation now was naturally different from before. Sang Sang looked calm and walked slowly with her hands behind her back, like a snow lotus falling in the wind. But Ning Ke, who was behind her, looked a little embarrassed. It was noon, and the early autumn sunshine was bright enough to clearly illuminate the smooth cliff and the narrow path made of gravel. But the cliff was thousands of feet deep, and the further they went, the darker the light became, and the temperature gradually dropped. It was very cold, and there was even snow between the cliff stones, which was quite amazing. They continued to walk in the cold world of ice and snow. After a long time, they finally walked out of the shadow cast by the wilderness into the giant sinkhole, and came to the bright sunshine. There was a boundless field under the sunshine. The field at the bottom of the sinkhole was very wide. Even with Ning Ke's sharp eyesight, he could not clearly see the scene in the distance. There were all kinds of yurts scattered in the field. On the ground near the cliff, there were cold-resistant meadows. Cows and sheep with long fluffy hair were eating in the meadows. Contrary to the process of walking down the cliff, the two of them walked toward the center of the giant sinkhole field. The temperature was getting higher and higher, as if it was going to warm spring from winter. The natural grass in the field was gradually replaced by artificially cultivated species, and the ears in the field kept swaying in the breeze to greet them. Ning Ke walked to the field and picked an ear. He rubbed the shell with his fingers, and found that the grain inside was much smaller than the rice commonly seen in the Central Plains, and the grain fragrance was a little strange. He pulled one out, and found that the root system of this plant was quite developed. He guessed that this was probably a special kind of rice, which could resist the cold by absorbing the warmth from the ground. Judging from the shape of the leaves, it probably had a relatively low demand for light. This underground wilderness was far away from the human world, so the sunlight was not as abundant as it was on the surface. Fortunately, Haotian was always fair. The temperature of the soil in the wilderness was a little high, and the rivers flowing through it were different from the cold rivers in Ning Ke's imagination. They were covered with a light mist like a hot spring. This underground field was a completely new world for Ning Quebec. Of course, because of his poor background and the influence of the academy, what he cared most about was food. At this moment, a faint bell suddenly rang in the distance, and then a pious buzzing sound came from all directions in the field, attracting his attention. He looked into the distance and vaguely saw countless people kneeling on the ground. He knew that they should be the farmers who worshipped the Xiankong temple. They started chanting after hearing the bell. The sound of the bell came from an even further distance, coming from the huge mountain peak in the middle of the vast wilderness. It was unknown which yellow temple, or hall in the middle of the peak, was the monk who was striking the bell. Sang Sang walked toward the mountain. Ning Ke suddenly thought of something, but he missed it, and could not remember it again. He shook his head regretfully and quickened his pace. The mountain was very tall and majestic. He could feel the pressure from miles away, as if it was right in front of him. But in fact, the mountain was still in the sky. Sang Sang did not say anything, and walked toward the mountain. Although she and Ning Ke did not deliberately, they still walked very fast. Even so, it still took them a long time to walk to the foot of the mountain. It was already dusk. The world at dusk should be warm, but for the world in the giant sinkhole, there was only darkness and coldness. The setting sun in the west could not reach here at all. The vast field at the bottom of the pit, and the entire mountain were shrouded in shadows. Only the highest peak was still in the twilight, like a candle flame. Looking at the mountain road in the night, Ning Ke quietly adjusted his breath, and was ready for battle. Although Sang Sang was unimaginably powerful, and even the chief monk of scripture was just a stone under her feet, the Xiankong temple on this mountain was, after all, the unknown place of Buddhism. It had been passed down for countless years, and had a deep foundation. Who knew what kind of dangers were hidden in it? Sang Sang suddenly stopped, and turned to look at the road they came from. Ning Ke felt a little strange. He followed her gaze and saw that the cliff they came down from at noon had become a scenery far away, and the snow between the cliffs had long been gone. The cliffs around the giant sinkhole were very far from the bottom of the mountain. According to common thinking, The cliff should have become an inconspicuous black line, but it was still towering at this time. The long cliff was too high. The mountain where the Xiankong Temple was located was higher than any mountain on the surface of the earth, but the peak was only level with the surface of the wilderness. This meant that the cliff surrounding the giant sinkhole was as high as the mountain, and higher than any other mountain in the world. Ning Ke and Sang Sang stood here and looked around. They felt that the giant sinkhole was a huge dry well, and the high cliff was the wall of the well. The people standing at the bottom of the well were blocked by the wall of the well. The people living here had seen the round sky for generations, while the fields in the field were square and incomparably orderly. Was this the so-called round sky and square earth? Ning Ke looked at the scene in front of him and thought with some shock. Sang Sang couldn't help but feel shocked. She only made such a comment about this magical world created by Buddha, a frog in a well. The two did not continue to stay. They walked directly to the peak under the cover of the night. The mountain road hidden in the forest and flowers was not as steep as before, but it was long as if there was no end. The big black horse and the horse carriage were left on the ground. Ning Ke naturally carried all the things that could not be separated from him. At the moment when Sang Sang boldly decided to come to the Xiankong Temple to confirm the life and death of Buddha, he had made clear his identity. He was a handyman, porter, cook, feet-washing technician, and bed warmer. He had no objection to this. It was a couple's life, and someone had to take care of the outside and the inside. Since his wife had the ability to take care of the outside, why not he take care of the inside? The heavy arrow case and iron cutlass, the big black umbrella, and the Buddhist chessboard were carefully packed into the luggage, which was now on his back. The luggage was too heavy, and the mountain road between the peaks was so long. Even though he had cultivated the Great Spirit and was extremely strong, he still felt a little tired. The mountain was too big, and there were too many yellow temples hidden in the forest. It was said that Yueluan Kingdom was a prosperous place for Buddhism, and there were 72 temples in Misty Rain. In an hour, he and Sang Sang had already seen more than this number of temples. Since Sang Sang was here to find someone, she naturally had to go to every temple. This meant that they had to walk a longer distance, which also meant that Ning Ke had to walk a longer distance with the heavy luggage, and he was climbing a slope. When they passed by each temple, Sang Sang did not look carefully, so it was hard to tell what method she was using. When they walked to the edge of a cliff, Ning Ke finally sat down on a stone. "Let's rest for a while." He wiped his sweat and said while panting, "I don't think it's a good idea to search blindly." Sang Sang was naturally not tired, but she felt a little tired and sleepy like she had been since they left Peach Mountain. She walked with her eyes closed most of the time, as if she was really sleeping. Of course, she did look like a blind person walking. Listening to Ning Ke's words, she said indifferently, "Do you want me to die so badly?" Ning Ke understood why she was so anxious to confirm whether Buddha was dead or alive. If Buddha was still alive, he would be the only existence in the world that could threaten her. She had to kill Buddha while she was still strong enough. Otherwise, she would be in great danger when she returned to the divine kingdom or became immortal. In this case, her words made sense, but he felt bored and said while covering his forehead, "Can you put it in another way? You have said it so many times. Aren't you tired of it? Can you not seek death at the slightest provocation? Although we are husband and wife, you can't really treat yourself as an ordinary woman." Sang Sang ignored him and said, "If I want to find someone, I will. Where is the person you are looking for?" Ning Ke came to Xiankong Temple mainly to accompany her, but also to find someone. Outside the academy, Seventh Sister had specifically told him to come here and see if that proud man was still as proud as he was now kneeling in front of the Buddha. Along the way from the foot of the mountain, Sang Sang had searched hundreds of yellow temples in the lower half of the mountain, but he just followed her and did not look like he was looking for someone. He said, "Senior brother will definitely not cultivate Buddhism here. Why waste your energy?" Sang Sang asked, "Why?" Ning Ke said with certainty, "Senior brother is such a genius. Who in Xiankong Temple is qualified to teach him? He must be reading Buddhist scriptures in the temple on the peak. Why would he linger in these shabby temples at the foot of the mountain?" Sang Sang thought for a while and looked at him. She said, "Idiot." Ning Ke thought that his inference was so reasonable, but she did not think of it. How could she call him an idiot? Ko Haoran could not bear it, and neither could Aunt Xiao. "How am I an idiot?" he asked angrily. Sang Sang ignored him and continued to walk up the mountain with her hands behind her. Ning Ke carried his heavy luggage and ran behind her. He kept asking himself how he was an idiot. She knew that her man liked to call others idiots. How could she call him an idiot for no reason? They searched all the way, but the temple was deserted at night. They searched all the hundreds of yellow temples and the dozens of cliffs at the foot of the mountain, but still found nothing. Finally, they came to the top of the mountain, and the night had passed. The new morning sun was still lying on the surface of the wilderness. The morning light first illuminated the cliff in the west, and then the peak. It was like a candle wick that had been extinguished for a whole night was reignited. Then the light spread from the peak to the foot of the mountain, at a speed visible to the naked eye. The bell rang, and the Buddhist chants were heard. The Buddhist land was thus awakened. Chapter 1. P.S. I don't have time to revise it recently. If there are any rough parts, just blink and pretend you didn't see it. Sorry, keep writing. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 942. When the Buddha land woke up, countless monks in the yellow temples also woke up. But as the saying goes, as long as Sang Sang is in my hand, I am in the human world. Ning Ke was not worried about being found by the Xiankong temple, so he continued to look around like last night. He would go into every yellow temple and carefully observe if there was any trace of his senior brother. It was a time-consuming thing, so it was Song Song's turn to feel troubled. On a cliff platform covered by ivy, she turned to Ning Ke and asked, "Are you looking for Jun Mo?" Ning Ke said, "Of course, I can't help you find Buddha." Sang Sang said, "Idiot." After saying this, she continued to walk forward on the cliff platform. Ning Ke was stunned. He was not as angry as last night but confused. Why did she say he was an idiot? As the indigo dress moved forward, the ivy separated and Sang Sang walked by. Ning Ke quickened his pace to catch up with her before the ivy swung back. Then he found that the cliff platform was a little strange. There was an unknown tree on the edge of the cliff with a green canopy, which was very quiet. There was a very small temple behind the pine tree. The yellow paint had long peeled off, and the stone steps were covered with dust. It seemed that no one had been here for many years. Along the way from the foot of the peak, all the temples were either magnificent or sacred. Ning Ke and Sang Sang had never seen such a dilapidated temple, which was very strange. What made Ning Ke even more strange was that he felt a faint familiar aura from the dilapidated temple. He and Sang Sang had practiced Buddhism in the Lank Temple, so they could sense the supreme Buddha nature in the aura. The trace of Buddha nature was very pure and compassionate, and very powerful, even more powerful than the Buddha nature they felt in the temples last night. How could a temple with such pure Buddha nature be so dilapidated? How could the monks in the Xiankong temple forget this temple? Who used to live in this shabby temple? Was this the place Sang Sang was looking for? Could it be that the Buddha was hiding here? Standing under the tree on the edge of the cliff, Ning Ke looked at the dilapidated temple and suddenly felt a little cold. He subconsciously leaned to Sang Sang and asked, "Is it here?" Sang Sang looked a little serious, but she did not say anything and walked directly into the temple. The temple door was pushed open with a squeak. When the cobwebs were about to fall, a breeze blew and swept to the endless abyss under the cliff. After entering, Ning Ke found that it was a fake temple. Standing on the cliff platform, he could only see the front of the temple. There was not even a Zen temple inside, but only a dusty corridor. The corridor led straight to the cliff, and there was a deep cave on the wall. Ning Ke became more and more nervous, but Sang Sang remained calm. She walked directly into the cave and looked around with her hands clasped behind her back, showing a touch of annoyance on her face. The cave was quiet and dry. The furnishings inside were extremely simple, even simpler than the cliff cave, where Ning Ke had secluded himself in the back mountain of the academy. There was only a futon. The futon was lying in front of the deepest cave wall, covered with dust. The futon was covered with dust. The futon was in Wazine. There was a shadow on the stone wall opposite the futon. Looking closely, one could find that the shadow was a human figure, and the cloud edge of the kasaya could be vaguely seen on the edge. A long time ago, there was a monk who meditated here and faced the wall. He sat there for countless years, and even left his figure on the stone wall. Which eminent monk was he? Ninkei was very shocked. Sangsang did not care who the eminent monk was. She took a look and knew that the person was not the Buddha she was looking for. So she was a little annoyed. You are too slow. Don't follow me. After saying this, she walked out of the cave. Ninkei looked at her back and said, I also want to find someone. Sangsang did not look back and said, Idiot. Ninkei did not want to be angry and said, Even if I am an idiot, I still want to find someone. What if we get lost? Sangsang said, I can find you. After Sangsang left, there was only Ninkei in the cave. He looked at the shadow on the stone wall and shook his head. He was ready to leave, but he slowly stopped at the entrance of the cave. Previously, under the tree on the cliff plateau, he felt that the aura from the ruined temple was very familiar. Now in the cave, this feeling became more and more obvious. He even felt that he had seen the shadow on the stone wall somewhere. Ninkei thought for a while, and turned back to the depth of the cave. He looked at the shadow on the stone wall and thought for a long time. Then he felt a little tired and sat on the ground. He forgot that the futon in front of the stone wall was so old that it could not stand people sitting on it. As soon as his body touched the futon, it scattered into countless cattail grass and floated everywhere. What the hell is this? Ninkei looked at the cattail grass on the ground and shook his head helplessly. He reached out and gathered all the loose grass together. Then he took out a needle and thread from his luggage and began to sew skillfully. It did not take long for him to mend the futon. He tried to make sure that the futon would not be damaged again. Then he stuffed it under his buttocks and continued to look at the shadow on the stone wall. The shadow on the stone wall was imprinted by the Buddha nature of the previous generation of eminent monks. It was indeed a very magical dharma. If it was in the temples of the human world, it would definitely be worshipped by countless believers of the Buddhism sect. But what did it have to do with him? Ninkei did not know why the shadow on the stone wall was so attractive to him. His eyes fell on it, and he did not want to look away. He always felt that there were countless mysteries waiting for him to discover. He was tired of standing, so he sat down. After sitting and watching for a long time, he was also a little tired, so he hugged his knees and rested his head on them. After a while he changed his posture again. He rested his chin on his hand and looked at the stone wall quietly. He was like a child in the countryside watching a social play, watching it with relish. During the process of looking at the wall, Ninkei did not sit cross-legged, did not sit on the lotus seat, did not make the emblematic gesture, and did not meditate. He looked very casual and seemed to be in a daze. But in fact he sat on the lotus in his sense of perception and made the emblematic gesture. The dharma that he had seen in the Lang temple and learned from Master Chishan kept floating in his mind, but he did not meditate. After a long time, Sangsang returned to the dark cave. She had gone to the 3 halls of the Xiankong temple for a long time, but still did not find that person. Seeing Ninkei in a daze, her eyes slightly brightened, but she did not say anything. She turned around and walked out of the cave again. This time, she went to the commandment yard on the west peak. There were countless towering ancient trees in the west peak, but there was still no trace of Buddha. Her expression became more and more serious. She stood on the twisted roots of the ancient trees that protruded out of the cliff, looking at the sun in the sky silently. If heaven's calculation could not be calculated, then there was no mystery of heaven. Then where should the heart of heaven fall? Sangsang returned to the remote cliff platform again, walked into the dilapidated temple, and came behind Ning Quebec. Ninkei was still in a daze while looking at the shadow on the stone wall. Sangsang left again. This time, she went to the east peak full of rugged rocks, but still found nothing. She stood among the rocks and looked at the sun in the sky silently. She returned to the old temple cave again. Ning-Kei was still facing the wall. She left again. And came back again. She had done this countless times. Although she was Haotian, she felt a little tired and puzzled. Heaven's calculation could not be calculated, and the mystery of heaven could not be seen. Why did the heart of heaven always fall on this guy's side? Could it be that she could not leave him? Thinking of this possibility, Sang-Sang looked at Ning-Kei's back with infinite hatred and irritation in her eyes. She wanted to kill him, and then suppress him to the deepest part of the earth. But she could not kill him after all. She still wanted to be herself. So she could only wave her sleeves, and leave the cave again to continue her search. Ning-Kei did not know that Sang-Sang had once wanted to kill him, and he almost died. He was still looking at the shadow on the stone wall with his chin in his hand. His expression kept changing, sometimes solemn, and sometimes silly. A day passed like this. When the sun set, a white flower bloomed on the unknown green tree by the cliff. It only bloomed for a moment, then left the branch and fell to the ground. The white flower fell on the cliff and touched the dust. It was blown up by the breeze outside the cliff, as if it was slowly lifted by a pair of invisible hands. It floated into the dilapidated temple door, drifted to the stone wall in the cave, and gently fell on Ning-Kei's shoulder. Ning-Kei reached out to pick the small white flower off his shoulder. He gently pinched the delicate flower handle with his fingers, looked at the shadow on the stone wall, and said with a smile, "So you used to learn Buddhism here?" With this sentence, the pieces of consciousness in the deepest part of his sense of perception, which had been sleeping for many years, suddenly lit up and then gradually faded, like the most dazzling brilliance of an old pearl. At dusk, the bell of Xinkong Temple rang again, echoing in every corner of the peak. Ning-Kei woke up and bowed to the shadow on the stone wall. Then he got up and walked out of the cave to the green tree by the cliff. He calmly looked at the scenery of the Buddha land in front of him. This old temple was the old residence of Lotus. When Lotus studied Buddhism in Xinkong Temple, he sat on the wall for several years in the cave, leaving his shadow and the legend of the front gate of Buddhism in the human world. In the front gate of Devil's Doctrine, he inherited the mantle of youngest uncle and everything of Lotus. Before Lotus died, he once said to him, "You have joined the devil. If you want to cultivate the devil's doctrine, you must first cultivate Buddhism. Then please walk bravely into the darkness. Although you have little chance of success, and may die as soon as you start on the road, I still wish you well and curse you." Ning-Kei had long forgotten this. Although he had cultivated Buddhism with Master Chishan in Lank Temple, it was to cure Sang-Sang. He had never actively studied Buddhism. It was not until today when he came to Xinkong Temple and meditated for a whole day in front of the shadow on the stone wall that he remembered the words and Lotus's instructions and really made up for this very important lesson. After facing the wall for a day, Ning-Kei had gained a lot. Although there was no change on the surface and his cultivation state was still in the knowing destiny state, he had planted a Bodhi seed in his heart. Perhaps the Bodhi seed would germinate and break out of the soil at any time. Eventually, it would grow green and cover the eyes of heaven and Buddha. In the twilight, Sang-Sang returned to the edge of the cliff. Ning-Kei said, "It seems that you still haven't found Buddha." Sang-Sang said, "You haven't found him either." Ning-Kei said, "I forgot to find senior brother." Sang-Sang asked, "What are you doing?" Ning-Kei said, "I'm looking at it." Sang-Sang said indifferently, "What's there to look at in the Buddhist psyche left by an old monk?" Ning-Kei walked to her and put the small white flower in her hair. He said happily, "It's really beautiful. The second chapter is really well written. If Ning-Kei becomes a heart thief, he really has the potential." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 943. At times like this, smart girls usually wouldn't speak. They would just lower their heads shyly. Smarter girls would probably take the opportunity to snuggle into a man's arms. Only overly smart girls would ask that question. "Do you mean the flowers are prettier, or am I prettier?" Sang-Sang would not ask such a question. She did not show any shyness on her face, nor would she snuggle into Ning-Kei's arms. She acted as if she had heard nothing, and went straight to the other side of the cliff yard. Ninkei was a little disappointed, but he felt very satisfied and happy when he saw the small white flower on her temple gently trembling in the evening wind, and noticed that she did not want to take it off. "Have you seen my second brother?" He pushed away the dense green vines and chased after Sang Sang to ask. In his opinion, second brother should be meditating on the Dharma on the peak, or somewhere in the commandment yard. Sang Sang should have seen him when she was looking for Buddha. Sang Sang did not turn around. She kept walking with her hands behind her back and said, "Idiot." Ninkei could not remember how many times she had called him an idiot. His anger had long turned into numbness. He shook his head helplessly and realized that he was really an idiot when he saw the scene below the peak. As dusk fell, the giant sinkhole surrounded by the cliff became extremely dark. Only the field near the peak could be vaguely seen because of the reflection of the yellow temple roof. There were countless black spots moving slowly in the field below the peak, looking like diligent ants. Ninkei knew that they were the farmers that he and Sang Sang had seen before. That year at the edge of the giant sinkhole, Ninkei estimated that there were more than 1,000 monks in Xiankong Temple, and at least 100,000 people living in the field to maintain this Buddhist country. Now that he came to the Xiankong Temple, he found that there were countless temples on this mountain, and the number of monks they supported was far beyond his imagination. There were at least tens of thousands of monks, which meant that there were millions of farmers who had been living in the dark underground world for generations. In order to maintain the existence of Xiankong Temple, the monks had to drive these farmers like livestock. In this sense, those farmers were more like serfs that had long been abolished in the Central Plains. The more difficult the place was, the stricter the social class was. Ninkei looked at the black spots moving slowly at the foot of the mountain and understood that those serfs must be carrying out daily offerings to the monks. His expression gradually became solemn, as if he had seen those tragic scenes that he had not really seen. At that time, he and Sang Sang only took a glance at Xiankong Temple and left quietly. At that time, he thought that if he was a man of great wisdom and courage, he might climb down the cliff and secretly go to the miserable world under the clouds to launch a rebellion among the serfs and overthrow the deformed Xiankong Temple. But he was not. Someone was wise and brave. That person was naturally second senior brother Junemo. Junemo left Chang and traveled thousands of miles to Xiankong Temple to cultivate Buddhism. However, with his temperament, how could he cultivate Buddhism after seeing the real situation of Xiankong Temple? Practicing Buddhism was not worshipping Buddha. Junemo saw that the world was so miserable. Not to mention kowtowing in front of Buddha, he would definitely draw his sword in anger and kill the monks and Buddha in the temple first. Ninkei searched for Junemo in the Xiankong Temple. No wonder Sang Sang called him an idiot. Senior brother must be down there. He looked at the gradually darkening miserable world at the foot of the mountain and said, "I'm going there to see him. Do you want to go with me?" Sang Sang came to Xiankong Temple to find Buddha. He thought that she would not be willing to spend time with him to find second senior brother, but he did not expect that she would agree. Climbing the peak last night and descending the mountain tonight, the yellow temples and palaces along the way were naturally different because of their different moods. In Ninkei's eyes, there was no difference between them and the White Bone Mountain in the front gate of Devil's Doctrine. When he climbed the mountain last night, he saw the magnificent and solemn temples and thought that it was natural for Xiankong Temple to be the holy land of Buddhism. But now he knew that it was not the case. Xiankong Temple was isolated from the world, but it could be so magnificent. It must have absorbed the marrow of the serfs at the foot of the mountain. The more magnificent the temple was, the more miserable the world under the mountain was. Walking down the giant peak and away from the ancient temple of Buddha land, they came to the real miserable world. The green and joyful field in his eyes yesterday now looked so gloomy in the night. The night could not completely blind Ninkei's eyes. He and Sang Sang moved forward in silence, and his eyes slowly swept across the field. He saw fields with different kinds of rice, underground rivers with hot steam, and even a few mountains. But these mountains were too inconspicuous compared to the giant peak, just like mounds of earth. At the bend of the river, He saw the place where people panned for gold. He also saw many arms cut off by sharp weapons. Behind the hill, he saw gems and emeralds in the grass. He also saw the corpses that were eaten by vultures. Occasionally, he could hear the strange cries of birds. The field was not completely dark, and he could see many bonfires emitting light. Tents and yurts were scattered on the ground. Nobles who were as fat as pigs wore all kinds of gem necklaces, held wine utensils made of skulls, and stepped on girls' naked breasts with their muddy feet. No matter which tribe it was, there were always a lot of valiant men standing next to the nobles. Those men held whips and sharp knives in their hands. Sometimes the whips fell on the cows and sheep, but more often on the female slaves. The sharp knives were sometimes used to cut the mutton, but more often they were stabbed into the chests of the men, or the fathers of the female slaves. Blood and wine mixed together. The nobles seemed so happy, while the cowardly and numb serfs could only keep kneeling in front of the temples on the mountain peaks, like useless ants. It was understandable that they were cowardly and numb. However, when those serfs used their hands to offer the most precious gold and silver, and the most chaste daughters to the monks, they looked so happy. There were not many monks in the field, but they had a status that even the nobles could not imagine. They sat in the warm yurts, and their palms gently fell on the heads of their believers, or on the girls who knelt beside them. The scene was a little weird. It was a mixture of holiness and obscenity, very mysterious but still dirty. Ning-Ke looked at the tent in the distance, and listened to the chanting and moaning coming from there. After a moment of silence, he shook his head and said, "It's really ugly." The small white flower in Song Song's hair gently trembled in the night wind. He looked at her and asked, "Why?" Ning-Ke had a very deep understanding of the ugly and tragic side of the human world. He did not know how much he had seen since he was a child. However, he could not understand why such an extremely unstable social structure could last for so many years, and why people living here could endure for so many years, and even seem very happy. "As I said, this is a well." Sang Sang looked at the cliff in the distant night sky and said, "They are like frogs in a well and can't see anything. When they see the monks on the mountain, they think they are real Buddhas. And Buddhas are the most deceptive." Ning-Ke thought for a moment and said, "Second brother is right. All monks should die." Sang Sang said, "The academy has always only looked at heaven, not the human world." She did not show any sarcasm on her face, but Ning-Ke knew what she wanted to say. However, even someone as unreasonable as him could not defend himself after seeing this miserable world. "You are right," he said, "but since second brother is here, the academy will definitely take care of it." Ning-Ke and Sang Sang walked a little slowly because they wanted to see. They did not walk until the next morning. The morning light illuminated the Xiankong temple between the peaks, but they were still a long distance away from the cliff. The closer they were to the cliff, and the farther they were from the peak where the Xiankong temple was located, the lower the temperature was, the poorer the crops were, and the more enslaved the serfs were, and the more miserable their lives were. The agricultural products in the field gradually became scarce, and the cold-resistant weeds gradually became lush. Cows and sheep with their long gray hair walked slowly in the meadow. There were piles of stones in the grass, and tattered banners were hanging on them. Ning-Ke had seen some piles of stones and banners the day before yesterday, but he did not pay much attention to them. Now when he walked closer, he found the scattered black blood, and a faint smell of blood on the stones. As they moved forward, he and Sang Sang saw more disabled serfs who had been tortured. Some had their tongues cut off, some had their ears cut off, and some had their calf bones smashed. They were in all kinds of miserable states. They looked so miserable and ugly that he couldn't bear to look at them anymore. Ning-Ke knew that his senior brother must be in the most miserable place, so he knew that he was on the right path. Sang Sang could not find the Buddha, but it was not difficult to find someone. So he took him to the depths of the meadow. Cattle and sheep were scattered on the meadow, as beautiful as clouds, but the color was a little out of place. Not far from the sheep, there must be a shabby yurt. Behind the yurt there was often a lake. The lake water was blue, salty or sweet. A large area of wetland was formed naturally by the lake water, and the aquatic plants were extremely abundant. A little girl in a dirty old leather coat was waving a small whip to drive her 4 lambs. Ning Ke and Sang Sang looked at the little girl and subconsciously thought of Tang Xiaodong. It was probably the first time for the little girl to see strangers, but she was not afraid at all. She smiled and waved to them. The smile on her dark face was so clean, and her teeth were so white that it made people dizzy. Ning Ke looked at her and smiled. The little girl drove the 4 lambs to them. Without saying anything, she took Ning Ke's hand and led him and Sang Sang to the yurt, meaning that they would be guests. This field was deep underground, isolated from the world, and outsiders could not find it. But it was still the human world. Ning Ke thought of the cruel scenes he had seen that night, and then looked at the little girl holding his hand. Suddenly, he thought of the ruined city of Wei, and the young men and women dancing around the bonfire outside the city of Wei. Hell and heaven were both in the human world. Sang Sang said, "Ignorance is naivety, and naivety is cruelty. Can't you see through it?" Ning Ke said, "Even so, there is no need to say it." At this moment, he saw the scene on the other side of the lake. There was a crowd of people kneeling on the ground, surrounding a monk. The monk was wearing a dirty khaki robe, and the sleeve of his right arm kept swinging in the wind. If it was someone else, it would be very ugly. But with his solemn and elegant demeanor, it looked so proper, and no one could find any fault with it. Chapter 3. And before 12 o'clock come out Chapter 4. Hell and heaven are both in the human world. This is the lyric of Do Wei's song, which was used when Lotus was born. A few days ago, a reader at me on Weibo. I saw it but I didn't reply. Then I suddenly realized that it was a good use here. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 944. In the field under the Xiankong Temple, the monks were all punished by the commandment hall, so they naturally had no patience for their followers. Their cruelty was even more terrible than that of the nobles in the tribes. The monk by the lake was able to make his followers kneel so close to him, and he did not frown because of the bad smell on them. He looked extremely calm and natural. The monk was so extraordinary that he was Junemo separated by the lake. The wind was a little strong. Ning Ke listened casually and did not hear what second brother was saying. He took the little girl's hand and walked over there, gradually quickening his pace. At this moment, the sound of galloping horses could be heard from the side of the meadow. A dozen or so strong men galloped over on fine horses, led by a man dressed in fur. He waved the whip in his hand as he looked at the nomads kneeling on the ground and scolded them sternly, probably telling them to disperse. The herdsmen got up in fear and wanted to disperse, but they were worried that the guru they had painstakingly invited would be hurt by the whip. They hurriedly waved their hands and explained to the man on the horse, "Lord Bai, this is..." Before he could finish speaking, the whip lashed down fiercely and landed on an old herdsman's shoulder, leaving a bloody gash. This was only because the man was not sitting properly. Otherwise, if the whip had landed, the old herdsman's shoulder would have been torn off. How vicious was this man! The men who followed the nobles all drew out their swords from their saddles and shouted at the herdsman by the lake. They did not advance and brandished their swords to threaten the herdsman by the lake. Some even urged their horses to drive them away. The nobles looked at Junemo, who was surrounded by the herdsmen, and shouted, "The living Buddha said that he is an evil man from the foreign sect, not a guru at all. Get out of the way." The herdsmen looked at the nobles in horror, but they did not get out of the way. They were not brave enough to disobey Lord Bai's order, but they firmly believed that Junemo was the guru. Otherwise, how could he be so merciful to them? Therefore, they were very afraid that Lord Bai would be punished by Buddha if he hurt the guru. The nobles also knew that it was impossible to explain to these stupid untouchables. He raised the whip in his hand and pointed at Junemo, saying, "Tie this cripple up." The living Buddha said that he would be burned to death. The men answered in unison and urged their horses to rush to the lake. The swords in their hands reflected the sunlight and looked extremely sharp. The herdsmen were frightened and fled in all directions. Seeing that the monk in yellow was about to be knocked down, the noble's eyes became cruel. The living Buddha had indeed said to capture this evil person alive and then burn him to death. However, this evil person actually dared to incite his own slave to rebel. Before he was burned to death, no matter what, he had to suffer. Should he cut off his ear, or cut off his remaining left arm, or peel off the skin of his face? Just as he was thinking about this, the nobleman suddenly felt a gust of cold wind behind his head. How could he dodge in time? He felt a chill on his ear, and then his left shoulder lightened. Then, he felt something wet on his face. Waves appeared in the blue lake, as if a strange beast was coming ashore. A black shadow broke through the waves, whistling through the air, and finally landed in the hands of the monk in yellow. It was a square and thick iron sword. Junemo waved the sword, and more than 10 heads flew into the air. More than 10 streams of blood sprayed from the necks of the men to the sky, as if to wash away the sinful sky. Although the iron sword was wide and thick, the person who used the sword never knew the meaning of it. He only knew the principle of righteousness. There was no intense scene, not even a battle. Junemo just waved the sword and everything was over. The nobles looked at this scene, and his face turned pale. He opened his mouth for a long time, unable to speak. Then he gradually felt the pain. He reached out to touch his face, and found that it was covered in blood. The iron sword broke through the lake, and landed in Junemo's hand. It happened to pass by the side of the noble's horse. With just a brush, the nobles lost an ear, an arm, and a piece of flesh was cut off from his face. The noble's face was covered in blood, and his ear and arm were cut off. He looked extremely miserable. When he found all this, he was even more painful and frightened, and almost fainted. As a man who had lived in such a harsh environment, he managed to keep himself from falling off the horse. But when he looked at Junemo by the lake, his eyes were filled with fear. The nobles did not expect that this evil man was so powerful. Without hesitation, he pulled the reins with his remaining arm, and rode back to his tribe. He did not dare to look back or say anything cruel, so that the evil man would wait for him to come back for revenge. Of course, he would definitely come back for revenge, and then he would kill all the people here. The herdsmen who had fled in all directions gradually came back, looking at the dozens of corpses by the lake, and the horses who were a little confused, because they had lost their owners. Their eyes were also very confused. Living in the cruel underground world, they had seen many bloody scenes, and even more brutal ones. But they had never imagined that the most powerful butchers of Lord Bai would one day be killed in such a simple way. Looking at the yellow-robed monk by the lake, the herdsmen knelt again. Their faces were full of awe and fear, and there was a faint uneasiness on their faces. They did not know what to do next. The old herdsman walked up to Junemo and knelt down. He kissed the ground in front of Junemo's shoes and said in a trembling voice, "Great and merciful Guru, please leave quickly." Junemo looked at the top of his head expressionlessly and said, "Because I will implicate you if I stay?" "No." The old herdsman raised his head. His dark face was full of wrinkles, and the wrinkles were full of painful tears. He said, "If you have time, you will definitely become the most powerful guru, or even the living Buddha. But although you are powerful now, you are still not enough. As for us, we will definitely die. Please don't worry." Junemo's expression gradually became gentle. He said, "That man will come with countless swords and arrows, and even the living Buddha you mentioned. So I have to stay here." The old herdsman said in a trembling voice, "Even if you can kill all the warriors of Lord Bai, or even defeat the living Buddha, you will anger the Buddha on the holy mountain." "The Buddha?" Junemo looked at the extremely high mountain in the distance and said expressionlessly, "In your eyes, the holy mountain is very high. But if you have a chance to walk on the ground, you will know that the mountain is actually very short. From the ground, it is just an inconspicuous little mound." Hearing this, the lakeside suddenly became very quiet. Only the sound of the fish swimming in the lake, frightened by the iron sword, could be heard. The herdsmen looked very confused. They had never heard such words. They did not know what the ground was. Was the field they were standing on not the ground? Was there another ground? Where was that ground? Why did the holy mountain look like a little mound when standing on that ground? No, how could the holy mountain be a little mound? A clear and childish voice broke the silence. Ning Ke held the little girl's hand and asked curiously, Master, where is the ground you mentioned? The herdsmen by the lakeside looked very frightened. In their opinion, the little girl's question should not be asked, because it meant blasphemy to the holy mountain and the Buddha. A middle-aged woman, who was probably the little girl's mother, was so scared that her face turned pale. She wanted to drag her back and beat her, but she found that her daughter was holding a stranger's hand, so she did not dare to do so. Junemo saw Ning Ke and Sang Sang. He was slightly stunned, and then ignored them. He said to the little girl, We are now underground, and the ground is above. He pointed behind him and said, Climb up this cliff, and you will arrive at the real ground. Behind him was the extremely high and steep cliff. For countless years, it was this cliff that imprisoned countless generations of serfs and herdsmen underground. In Song Song's words, it was the wall of a well, but in fact, it was the wall of a prison. The herdsmen followed his finger and looked at the cliff, but they could not see the end. It was often surrounded by clouds and mist. They thought that this cliff was almost as high as the holy mountain. How could they climb up? For countless years, no one had ever climbed up this cliff. In the teachings of the monks, this idea gradually became an act of blasphemy to the Buddha. Who dared to try? The herdsmen looked at the cliff and suddenly came to their senses. They found that they really wanted to see what the ground above the cliff was. They could not help but feel guilty and kept kowtowing. Junemo looked at the herdsmen and asked, Don't you want to know what is above? No one answered him. The old herdsman said piously, Master, that place is the divine kingdom of Buddha. How can we sinful mortals go there? Junemo ignored him and looked at the crowd, hoping to hear a different answer. However, after a long time, the lakeside was still quiet. He looked a little tired and a little disappointed. At this moment, the little girl who was holding Ning Ke's hand spoke. Maybe it was because Ning Ke's warm hands gave the little girl a lot of courage. She said softly in a clear voice, I want to go up and have a look. Countless people looked at the little girl. Her mother even fainted. The little girl lowered her head, looking a little uneasy and scared. Ning Ke gently squeezed her hand and comforted her. Don't be afraid. The little girl raised her head bravely. She pointed to somewhere in the middle of the cliff and said, I not only want to go up, but I really went up. Although I didn't climb very high, I climbed there. From there I can see further. I saw the lambs that ran to the Golden Lake. Then I found them. Then I saw a snow lotus on the cliff. The little girl said while looking at the crowd. The herdsmen by the lake looked up in shock. They followed the little girl's thin hand to look at the cliff, and found that it was not high. They could really climb up. How could there be a snow lotus there? No matter how high the cliff is, as long as you dare to climb, you can climb to the top one day. But if you don't dare to climb, how can you see the snow lotus no matter how close it is? Junemo looked at the cliff and said calmly, Chapter 4 There's more today. I'll say it later because I'm hungry and haven't had dinner. Chapter 5 will be about 1 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 945. But it's the divine kingdom of Buddha on the cliff. The herdsman by the lake said in a trembling voice. The hope and curiosity in their eyes were replaced by awe and uneasiness. But some emotions could never be erased once they appeared. I came from the ground, and so did the two of them. If the ground is the divine kingdom of Buddha, then you can regard us as the messengers of Buddha. Junemo looked at the herdsman and said calmly. He began to tell the story in the Buddhist scriptures. It was a perfect nirvana without snowstorms or bullying by nobles. In that world, there were heavenly maids scattering flowers, countless colored glazes, and spring all year round. It was the most beautiful place in humans' imagination. Sang Sang looked at that place and suddenly said, The people from the academy are really crazy. Ning Ke found that even a gentleman like second brother would lie. He sighed and said, Only the truly merciful people would make such a sacrifice. Sang Sang said. Junimo should learn from you when it comes to deceiving people. He said helplessly. Can there be a day when you won't say bad things about me? Song Song's answer was concise. It was not that she couldn't, but she said, why? Junmo's voice kept echoing by the lake like the warmest spring breeze. The herdsmen were fascinated, and had long forgotten their previous fear and uneasiness. After the preaching, the herdsmen all knelt and bowed to Ning Ke, and then dispersed. Junemo walked to Ning Ke and patted him on the shoulder. Then he looked at Sang Sang and asked, are you looking for a way back? Not everyone could be so natural in front of Haotian. The abbey dean couldn't do it. The chief monk of scripture couldn't do it. The drunkard and the butcher couldn't do it. And even eldest brother couldn't do it. Junemo could do it because he had never been afraid of death. He only respected the headmaster, the youngest uncle, and the eldest brother. So he was naturally fearless and regarded Haotian as ordinary. And many years ago, on the nameless mountain in the north of Chang'an, he decided to treat Sang Sang as a little girl who deserved to be pitied when he saw her kneeling by the cliff and holding the ashes in her hands. Sang Sang had a similar feeling after leaving the divine halls of West Hill, especially after entering the Tang territory. But this was the first time she saw someone treat her like an ordinary person, except for Ning Quebec. She frowned slightly, not knowing if she should be angry or calm. Junemo ignored what she was thinking and continued. What's wrong with staying in the human world? Teacher said that you would be very pitiful. And now it seems that it is indeed so. Sang Sang was really angry. She had felt Ning Ke's pity in the West Hill Divine Palace, and Imo Shanshan's pity by the Ink Lake in the Great River Kingdom. At this time, she heard from Junemo that the headmaster also felt sorry for her, and she could not help but be angry. Why would Haotian need the pity of mortals? All humans, including the headmaster of the academy, have been defeated by me. What right do you have to pity me? She reached out to Junemo. Junemo raised his eyebrows and tightened his grip on the iron sword. This iron sword could shatter the Buddha statue in length, sweep away thousands of soldiers in front of the verdant canyon, make Yisu confused, and make Lu Bai retreat. But it could not stop this hand. Song Song's hand fell on Junmo's face. Since she had made her move, she didn't do anything else. She looked at Junemo quietly, and the atmosphere by the lake became a little strange. Ning Ke had never understood why she would accompany him to find second brother, instead of looking for Buddha. Looking at this scene, he realized that there was indeed something hidden in it. Song Song's hand began to move on Junmo's face, sliding over his eyebrows, his nose, and his lips. Ning Ke was stunned and thought, what are you doing? This is your eldest uncle. As her husband, when he saw her touching Junmo's face, jealousy welled up in his heart, and he was very angry. Junmo's monk robe rose with the wind, and so did his anger. The atmosphere suddenly became extremely tense, and the situation was on the verge of exploding. At this time, Ning Ke suddenly fell forward and hugged Junmo's thigh, begging, Senior brother, please bear with it a little longer. You can't beat her. A tragic drama between heaven and man was about to be staged, but it was suddenly disrupted by this uninvited guest. Junmo's eyebrows slightly trembled, and he wanted to kick him away. Song Song's hand finally left Junmo's face. She turned around and walked to a very small tent by the lake. She slightly frowned and thought, it's not him either. Where is Buddha hiding? Why can't I find him? She knew that the tent was Junmo's residence. She walked to the tent, unceremoniously lifted the curtain, and was about to walk in. But before she entered, she thought of one thing. She looked back at Junemo and said, I grant you immortality. Junemo said without thinking, we'll talk about it when you are truly immortal. Since Sang Sang came to the human world, she had granted immortality to many people. They all had different reactions. The drunkard and the butcher were overjoyed. Tang Xiaotang thought it was too sudden, and suggested that she buy the food for the evening first. Mrs. Zeng just hugged her and cried, and didn't understand what she said. Ning Ke simply chose to refuse. Most of the time, she didn't hear what she wanted. But today, Junemo gave her a very unexpected answer, which made her feel very puzzled. It's up to you. She stood outside the tent and thought for a while. Then she said and walked in. Looking at the tent, Ning Ke felt very helpless and said, "You really sold immortality like cabbages, and it was a big sale. But the method was so rough that no one would buy it no matter how cheap it was." Junemo asked, "What is she doing?" Ning Ke said, "Senior brother, you used to treat her very well, so she wants to return the favor." Junemo was a very smart person. He only needed to hear this sentence to understand what Haotian meant. He said, "She actually wants to use this method to cut off her relationship with the human world. What an idiot." Ning Ke sighed and said, "I also think she is an idiot." Junemo said, "It seems that she hasn't found a way to return to the divine kingdom. That's why she is so mischievous. What about you? Have you found a way to let her stay in the human world?" Ning Ke remembered the sentence that he thought of before Chong, and then said, "Not yet. I wanted to come to Xiankong Temple to see if I could get any inspiration, but now it seems that it is meaningless. There could be a perfect method in the world that would not betray Chong, and not betray the human world. This method must be far more profound than the Buddhist Dharma." Junemo said, "I have been watching the moon these days. The headmaster seems to be struggling. If she goes back, the human world will definitely be defeated. So younger brother, you have to work harder." Ning Ke said after a moment of silence, "If that day really comes, we have to use the last method." Junemo said, "I don't want to go against human relations." Ning Ke said, "Senior brother is a gentleman, but I am not." Junemo looked at the iron sword in his hand and said after thinking, "I still don't think it is right." Ning Ke didn't want to continue this topic and said, "Senior brother, you have been in Xiankong Temple for some time. What new things have you encountered?" Junemo raised the iron sword in his hand and pointed to the majestic mountain in the distance. He said, "In such a dirty place, what else can there be except dirty people and things?" Ning Ke thought that his question was indeed a bit stupid. With second brother's temperament, he would not be interested in visiting the ancient times. He said, "Senior brother, it is fun to preach and kill people in the wilderness." Junemo shook his head and said, "You came at the right time. I just started killing people today. I have been telling stories from the Buddhist scriptures to the herdsmen and serfs for the past few days." Ning Ke found it a bit hard to understand. He thought that senior brother hated the Buddhism sect and monks the most. Even if he had never read the Buddhist scriptures, how could he preach to the devout believers of the Buddhism sect? Junemo said, "I read some Buddhist scriptures in the back of the mountain, and some more on the journey. These herdsmen can't even read the words. It is more effective to preach some simple stories." Ning Ke praised, "Senior brother, you are so kind. You must have some enlightenment when you preach." Junemo said indifferently, "In my opinion, the Buddhist scriptures are all lies. What enlightenment can there be?" Ning Ke was puzzled. The people here have lived underground for generations and worshipped the Xiankong Temple with their flesh and blood. However, they have never heard of Buddhism. So when I preached, they were wild with joy and regarded me as a real guru." Junemo looked at the gradually cold and gloomy wilderness, and his voice gradually became cold. He said, "The Buddhism sect claims to deliver all living beings from suffering, but treats them as pigs and dogs. The Buddhism sect claims that there are endless mysteries in the Buddhist scriptures, but they don't even let their believers read them. Then what is the difference between the Buddhist scriptures and waste paper? What is the difference between them and liars?" Ning Ke asked, "Senior brother, what are you going to do next?" Junemo said, "I came here to meditate and cultivate Buddhism. Who would have thought that the Buddha is so hateful? How can I meditate after seeing the 3,000 miserable worlds? These bald donkeys all deserve to die." Ning Ke reminded him, "Seventh sister said that we can't use bald donkeys to scold people." Junemo stroked his new dark hair and said, "Since there is new hair, we can scold them." Ning Ke praised, "That makes sense." Junemo looked at the crescent moon in the night sky and said, "The headmaster is fighting with Haotian. As his disciple, I should serve him. But my cultivation is too low, and I can't ascend to heaven or defeat her. So I can only do what the academy should do in the human world. Let's get rid of the Xiankong temple first. Ning Ke praised again. Senior brother is really merciful. Junemo turned to look at him and said, since I started killing people today, I will kill people every day. I will kill more and more people. I can only ignore your matter for the time being. In the previous battle by the lake, the nobleman left after cutting off his ear, arm and face. Ning Ke knew that it was his senior brother's arrangement. Otherwise, the nobleman would definitely die. His purpose was naturally to kill more people tomorrow. Killing those noblemen will definitely attract the monk soldiers. Killing the monk soldiers will attract the guru and living Buddha. Senior brother's sword shakes the world, and eventually the Xiankong temple will be alerted. I am afraid that we can't kill them all. Ning Ke was a little worried. I told those herdsmen that no matter how high the cliff is, as long as you are willing to climb it, you will climb to the top one day. The same goes for killing people. As long as you keep killing, there will be a day when you can kill them all. Junemo gazed at the majestic peak in the darkness of the night and said, look at the pitch-black mountain over there. I'll kill all the dogs underground first. Then I'll rush over and kill all the bald donkeys in the temple. Then I'll burn down the mountain. Ning Ke praised again. Cultivating Buddhism means killing Buddha. Senior brother, you are so merciful. Junemo said, wrong. Killing Buddha is cultivating Buddhism. Ning Ke said, maybe this is the real merciful Buddhism. Junemo said, yes. Even if Buddha was reborn and stood in front of me, I would still say the same thing. Ning Ke was silent for a moment and said, maybe Buddha is still alive. Don't be naughty, he said. Of course, even if Buddha is still alive, I will kill him with a sword. Killing Buddha when encountering Buddha. This was the Buddha that Junemo cultivated. Tears welled up in my eyes. I can't believe I wrote 5 chapters. Thank you for not believing me. Finally, I sincerely ask you to vote for me. The book review section needs this very much. Thank you. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 946. Ning Ke asked, what if I can't kill him? Junemo said, then I'll die. He said it calmly, but Ning Ke was shocked. After a long silence he said again, senior brother, Buddha might still be alive. Junemo didn't believe it at all. He scolded seriously, you fool. Buddha has already reached nirvana. If he is still alive, how could Headmaster and Haoyan not know? Ning Ke sighed and said, she really doesn't know whether Buddha is alive or not. Otherwise, why would she come to Xiankong Temple? After a moment of silence, Junemo said, then let's find him first. When they returned to the small tent by the lake, Sang Sang was sleeping. It turned out that Haoyan felt sleepy. Hearing footsteps, she opened her eyes and looked at Ning Quebec. She said, I'll spare his life and cut off this mortal bond. Junemo said, before the verdant canyon, I said that I don't need heaven to spare my life. Ning Ke said earnestly, you can't cut off your mortal bond just because you want to. Can you be reasonable? Sang Sang sat up and looked at Junemo. She said, I don't understand. If Buddha wants to kill me, it should be what the Academy wants to see the most. Why are you on my side? She was Haoyan, so she could know Junmo's preference from his expression. She didn't mention Ning Ke's position because she was used to Ning Ke's following. Junemo said calmly, shameless. Shameless meant being on the same side as him. Ning Ke's answer was more direct. He said, the Academy can't afford to lose that person. After leaving the lake and meadow in front of the cliff, Ning Ke and Sang Sang walked around in the field underground, trying to find traces of Buddha being alive or dead. Sometimes when they were grilling fish by the lake, he would wonder what second brother was doing now. Was he killing nobles and soldier monks with the iron sword? Or was he arguing with those unreasonable living Buddhas? In the next few decades, Junemo would hold the iron sword and keep fighting in this miserable world. The Buddhist land, which had been silent for countless years, would be stirred up. The Xiankong Temple, which enslaved millions of serfs, would probably start to tremble because of fear. Thinking of those images, Even someone as cold-blooded as him felt a little emotional. He wished he could join hands with his senior brother. But now he had more important things to do. Even if he finished the deal with Buddha and Haotian, he still had to return to Chang and to do the big sale in the human world. The journey to find the Buddha continued. Ning Ke and Sang Sang walked through the vast field at the bottom of the giant sinkhole, but still found no clues. The two became more and more silent. The unknown was unsettling, especially for those who were omniscient. She walked through the wilderness, returned, and climbed the mountain again. She walked back and forth between the numerous temples between the forest cliffs. She meditated in front of the solemn Buddha statues and stood at the edge of the cliff, staring at the sky in a daze. On the west peak, in the main hall of the commandment yard, they stood among the towering old trees, listening to the sound of the board falling heavily on the monks. On the east peak, they stood in the shadow of the cliff rocks, watching the warrior monks stomping on the ground. In the Mahavira hall at the top of the peak, they saw Qin Yen who was meditating. In the hut behind the hall, they saw a thin old monk who was cooking porridge, and then they saw an ancient bell. The Xiankong temple between the peaks looked so solemn and peaceful, totally different from the world below the peak. Looking at these images, Ning Ke was very puzzled. The Buddhism sect claimed to be merciful. How could they meditate on the peak, while the common people suffered under the peak? How could they meditate while sitting on the peak, and thinking about the people under the peak? In the yellow temple on the cliff platform below the peak, Ning Ke saw an acquaintance. It was Master Huang Yang, who left Chang, and then returned to the Xiankong temple to ask Buddha again. At that time, Sang Sang was elsewhere, so Huang Yang only saw him. Master Huang Yang was a little surprised. Ning Ke briefly told him what had happened these days, and then the master realized that so many things had happened in the world. He said, "You'd better leave as soon as possible." Ning Ke slightly frowned and asked, "What's wrong with the Xiankong temple?" Master Huang Yang shook his head and said, "I don't know what's wrong, so there should be something." Master Huang Yang was the younger brother of the emperor of the Tang Empire, and his status in the secular world was extremely noble, so he was naturally treated with courtesy in the Xiankong temple. However, these days, the Xiankong temple was still worshipping him, but no monk came to visit him. It gave people a feeling that the Xiankong temple was deliberately isolating him, which made him a little vigilant. The moment he saw Ning Ke, the master knew where the trouble came from. In the wilderness, Sang Sang stomped the chief preaching monk into the solid ground, but the chief preaching monk did not die. It was not surprising that the Xiankong temple knew the news of her and Ning Ke's arrival. Ning Ke was not worried. As the saying goes, with Haotian in one's arms, no one could defeat him. Master Huang Yang knew what he was thinking, but he had a different idea. He untied the string of prayer beads on his wrist and handed it to him. With a solemn expression he said, "Buddha is merciful, but there are times when thunder strikes." Hearing the words "Buddha is merciful" in the Xiankong temple, Ning Ke subconsciously felt a little uncomfortable. He walked to the stone steps in front of the temple, pointed to the world under the peak covered by clouds, and said, "Is there mercy there?" Master Huang Yang knew that he had been walking in the world under the peak for a long time. He said, "Many years ago, the Buddha established the Buddha kingdom with great wishes and built countless yellow temples among the peaks. He also gathered countless sinful people to farm and graze here to support the monks. He hoped that the monks could be enlightened by the Dharma and wash away their sins." Ning Ke said, "It's all bullshit. Let's not talk about whether the mortals who were captured by the Buddha were really sinful. Even if they were, they had their own laws to deal with them. I'm just a cultivator. How could I be qualified to convict them? Even if those people were really sinful, or even 10 generations of evildoers, what sins did their descendants have? Why do we have to live in this godforsaken place for generations?" Master Huang Yang had Buddha in his heart, so he couldn't agree with Ning Ke's accusation. But he also knew that there was no way to refute it. After a long silence he said, "This life is the most bitter, but the next life may be the happiest." Ning Ke turned around on the stone steps and looked at the Buddha statue in the temple. He said, "No matter how happy the next life is, how can it be equal to countless generations of suffering? The Buddha you worship is really disgusting." Master Huangyang said, "Maybe it's wrong, but who dares to disobey the rules set by the Buddha?" Ning Ke said, "To cultivate the Buddha, you need to meditate. The monks sit among the peaks and enjoy the offerings of those slaves. Can you really meditate? Can you really meditate?" Master Huangyang said, "Most of the monks in the temple have never been to the foot of the peak in their lives." Ning Ke said, "But they are not fools. They know very well what the world under the peak is like. Besides, the Xiankong temple is also going to enter the human world. Those monk soldiers who go to the human world, or powerhouses like you and Qin Yan, have to pass through the field to get out of the giant sinkhole. How can you ignore those poor people?" Master Huangyang said, "What you said makes sense. The Xiankong temple has been passed down for countless years. Naturally, there are really merciful eminent monks. Even if they violate the commandments of the Buddha, they want to make changes, but they all fail. What makes those eminent monks most confused is that when they try to make changes, the people under the peak become at a loss, as if suffering has become the dependence of their lives." Ning Ke said, "Faith is an addiction. If you want to get rid of it, it's inevitable that you will feel pain at the beginning. But how can you just let it go just because of temporary pain?" Master Huangyang said, "But if the Buddha land starts to collapse, how can you do anything?" Ning Ke said, "Why should we care about this damn place if it collapses?" Master Huangyang shook his head helplessly. He thought that Ning Ke, as a person outside the world, was right to think so. But how could the monks in the temple, as the disciples of the Buddha, watch the Buddha land being destroyed? Ning Ke said again, "If those eminent monks are really merciful, how can they bear it?" Master Huangyang said, "They can't bear it, but they can't do anything about it. So they can only leave." Ning Ke said, "So you left the Xiankong temple and returned to Chang'an?" Master Huangyang said, "Yes, there are many monks like me who left the Xiankong temple. When Master Qishan was young, he read all the Buddhist scriptures and understood all the Dharma. He was regarded as the only successor by the chief monk of the Xiankong temple at that time. However, he couldn't bear to see the suffering of the people under the peak. So he finally broke the mountain gate and went to the Lank temple." Ning Ke looked at the golden Buddha statue in the temple and thought of Master Qishan, who was sick from overwork in the cave on Hua Mountain. He was silent for a long time and said, "The heart of Buddha can't bear it." Ning Ke returned to the remote cliff yard, pulled out the green vines, and came to the tree in front of Lian Sheng's old residence. He didn't know what kind of tree it was. He only remembered that when he came here a few days ago, there was only one white flower on the whole tree. The wind blew it to his shoulder, and now it was inserted in Song Song's hair. Only a few days later, the tree was full of small white flowers. They spread their petals among the not dense green leaves, exuding a very pleasant floral fragrance, and gradually drifting away with the breeze. Sang Sang walked to him. As she said a few days ago, no matter where Ning Ke was, she could easily find him. He would never let her get lost. The breeze blew between the cliffs. The green leaves and small white flowers trembled slightly, at a speed visible to the naked eye. The green leaves gradually thickened, and the small white flowers gradually withered. The scene was extremely magical. Only the small white flower in Song Song's hair was still delicate and fresh. The green leaves thickened and the white flowers withered, but it didn't mean that it was desolate. It could also be a bumper harvest, because only when the flowers fell would they bear fruit. It didn't take long before the tree was full of green pears. Ning Ke didn't know that the tree by the cliff was actually a pear tree until then. He reached out to pick a green pear from the branch, and found that it was much smaller than the common pears in the world. The surface of the pear was very light, tender and juicy. Ning Ke had seen this kind of green pear before, and so had Sang Sang. It was in the cave behind the Buddha statue on Hua Mountain several years ago. Master Qishan took out a green pear for Sang Sang to eat, and then Sang Sang gave him half. The green pear was really delicious. Looking at the green pear in his hand, Ning Ke was a little hesitant and even vigilant. Last time, He and Sang Sang fell asleep after eating this green pear, and were sucked into Buddha's chessboard. It would have been fine if it was any other time, but now he and Sang Sang were in Xiankong Temple. Ningke had been wondering why the monks in Xiankong Temple were always so calm. Even if they couldn't find Sang Sang in him, they should be a little nervous. However, countless temples between the peaks were still as usual. Some were chanting, some were meditating. The commandment hall was still punishing the monks, and the warrior monks kept stamping the ground. The morning bell and evening drum were still refreshing. Xiankong Temple was too peaceful now. What were the monks in Xiankong Temple waiting for? Were they waiting for the Dharma that the Buddhism sect emphasized? Were they waiting for the moment when the Dharma came? Where was that moment? Was it on this green pear? Ningke looked at the small green pear in his hand and frowned slightly. At this moment, a very melodious bell suddenly came from the peak. Could it clear the mind? Ningke didn't think so. When he heard the bell, his heart suddenly tightened, as if it was held by an invisible hand and would be crushed in the next moment. The bell could not clear the mind, but it could only shock the mind. Ningke's face instantly turned pale, and he almost crushed the small green pear in his hand in pain. Then he spat out a mouthful of dark red blood. He didn't know when her hand, which passed through the breeze between the cliffs, had grasped his hand. It was Song Song's hand. A pure and powerful divinity came from her hand, and instantly occupied Ningke's body and mind. It repaired his broken heart at an unimaginable speed. Ningke got rid of the desperate situation, and looked at the peak where the bell came from. His clothes were stained with blood, and his face was also stained with blood. There was still lingering fear in his eyes. The melodious bell came from the Grand Buddha's hall of Xiankong Temple, from the ancient bell that he and Sang Sang had seen before. However, he had never thought that the bell would be so terrifying. As his cultivation of the Great Spirit deepened, his body became as strong as steel. Ordinary knives and arrows couldn't even break his skin, let alone his heart, which was wrapped in layers of Great Spirit. However, a bell from Xiankong Temple had shattered his heart and almost killed him. Feeling the warmth in his hand, Ningke once again felt the so-called "with Sang Sang in my hand, I have the world." No matter how terrifying the bell was, no matter how powerful Xiankong Temple was, as long as he held Song Song's hand tightly, he could still live even if she cut him into pieces. This was the conclusion that Ningke had come to after countless blood and tears in the Divine Hall of Light and the Yu prison. He was very confident. Holding Song Song's hand, he was no longer afraid and could listen to the bell carefully. The sound of the bell reverberated among the cliffs and countless temples. It was so distant. Gradually, the chanting of sutras began to merge with the sound of the bell. In countless temples, countless monks were chanting Buddhist scriptures. The chanting was mixed together and buzzing. It was impossible to tell which Buddhist scripture they were chanting. Every Buddhist temple in the world started the day with the bell, which was the morning bell. When the morning bell rang, the monks woke up and began to chant devoutly. It was the morning class. When the Xiankong Temple woke up, the real Buddhist land left by Buddha in the human world also began to show its true appearance. A light of Buddha appeared on the cliff plateau and covered Sang Sang. Ningke looked at this scene and felt cold all over. His heart seemed to stop beating, because he remembered a scene in the back hall of Lank Temple many years ago. This chapter is 4,000 words. There are more chapters today, but I'm a little tired and will write slowly. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 947. Many years ago, in the autumn, a ray of Buddha's light penetrated the temple and fell on Sang Sang. That ray of Buddha's light was so merciful and so cold. In the Buddha's light, Song Song's face became paler, and her thin body became smaller. She looked at Ningke outside the Buddha's light, and cried silently. From that moment on, she became the daughter of Yama, and suffered endless pain and fear. Then she and Ningke began to be hunted by the whole human world. That ray of Buddha's light was undoubtedly the most fundamental turning point in Ningke and Song Song's lives. Everything that happened after that actually began from that. How could Ning Ke not remember it? At this time, looking at the Buddha's light on the cliff plateau, and Sang Sang in the Buddha's light, he seemed to return to those years. The most painful and cold emotions all poured into his mind. No! He cried painfully. The Buddha's light appeared so suddenly that it connected the cliff plateau with the sky. Even Sang Sang couldn't tell whether it came from the sky or from the bottom of the cliff plateau. To be more precise, the Buddha's light connected the cliff plateau with the clouds. Countless layers of clouds floated over the mountain peak and completely covered the real blue sky. Sang Sang looked up at the depths of the Buddha's light with her hands behind her back. She looked calm. Her face was extremely pale, and now it was as white as snow under the bright light. Since she had to put her hands behind her back, she naturally didn't continue to hold Ning Ke's hand, because even she couldn't be too distracted in the face of the Buddha's light. However, at this moment, she heard Ning Ke's painful cry behind her. Even the Buddha's light didn't make her frown, but Ning Ke's voice made her frown slightly. She turned to look at Ning Ke and asked, "Don't what?" Ning Ke was affected by the Buddha's light and was vomiting blood in pain. Because he was worried about her safety, his face became extremely pale. He didn't expect that things would develop completely differently from what he had imagined. He looked at Sang Sang in the Buddha's light and didn't know what to say. Sang Sang didn't cry, vomit blood, fear, or call his name. Sang Sang was not as thin and pitiful as she used to be. Her figure was so tall that even the Buddha's light couldn't overshadow her. Only then did he remember that Sang Sang had grown up. She was now the omnipotent and omniscient Haotian. She was no longer the little handmaiden who could not leave him. She no longer needed his protection. On the contrary, she began to protect him. "It's nothing," Ning Ke said with a smile. Then, he realized that he really didn't know what to say, so he vomited another mouthful of blood. Sang Sang was a little annoyed, thinking that humans were really troublesome creatures. One moment he was frightened, the next moment he was smiling. She actually couldn't figure out what was going on in his mind. Looking at the blood overflowing from the corner of Ning Ke's mouth, she thought she understood what he meant. With Ning Ke's state, without her holding his hand, he was naturally in great pain under the coercion of the Buddha's light. He said no, which meant he didn't want her to let go of his hand. As for what he said after that, it was naturally the boring pride of a male animal. "I'm busy," Sang Sang asked him. "Don't you know how to hold an umbrella?" In the past, it was she who vomited blood, but now it was his turn. Ning Ke was immersed in the sentimental mood brought by this change. Hearing this, he came to himself and hurriedly took out the big black umbrella and opened it. Since that autumn in Leng Temple, the big black umbrella had been tortured over these years and had long been tattered. Ning Ke took an old cloth from the jade tree and mended it, but it still looked extremely ugly. It was like a beggar's clothes with countless patches. Because it hadn't been washed for many years, it was full of black mud and didn't have the beautiful feeling of a blooming black lotus. Ning Ke didn't care. When he found that the black umbrella could really block the Buddha's light, he was very happy. He followed Sang Sang's gaze and looked into the depths of the Buddha's light, trying to find out where the enemy was. He was in a good mood, so was Sang Sang. Xiankong Temple finally responded. Instead of being afraid, she was very expectant. As long as there was a change, it would be good. The clue of Buddha's whereabouts might be in it. However, the next change was somewhat beyond their expectations. The sound of sutra echoing between the cliffs gradually became orderly. The loud and distant bell didn't cover the sound of sutra. It was more like the wind in a bellows, helping the sound of sutra to become louder and louder. With the change of the bell and the sound of sutra, the Buddha's light on the cliff yard also changed. The light became clearer and quieter, and the Buddha's power contained in it became more and more terrifying. Sang Sang still stood in the Buddha's light with her hands behind her back, looking calm and composed. Ning Ke's hand holding the handle of the umbrella trembled slightly. It became more and more difficult. He hurriedly stuffed the green pear into his sleeve and held the umbrella handle with both hands to barely support himself. At the peak, behind the grand hall of Xiankong Temple, there was no monk beside the ancient bell, but it swayed in the wind. The bell resounded through the entire giant peak, and the field under the peak, until it reached the cliff far away, and then was knocked back. It kept repeating, making people intoxicated. On the stone steps in front of the grand hall, dozens of monks sat cross-legged. They put their palms together and closed their eyes to meditate. They kept chanting along with the rhythm of the bell, as if they were singing. Qin Yan sat at the forefront. He was a powerhouse of the Buddhism sect, who had been practicing silent meditation for many years. Today, he read countless times more words than he had said in the past 10 years. The sound of sutra contained infinite power. The other dozens of monks were extremely old. Their white eyebrows seemed to hang down to their chests, and their palms put together were more wrinkled than the oldest tree's bark. It was obvious that they were elders in the Xiankong temple. There were also people chanting in the grand hall. Master Chi Mei, who was seriously injured by eldest brother in front of the Pamir Mountains, knelt in the most pious posture in front of the Buddha statue and kept chanting. The back of his head was seriously deformed, so the sutra he chanted was a little vague. However, when he walked out of the hall, it became extremely clear. In several yellow temples in the East Peak and West Peak, hundreds of monks in red cassocks sat cross-legged on the cliff platform. They put their palms together and looked determined. They kept chanting. In dozens of temples in the mist on the mountainside, thousands of monks in gray cassocks sat cross-legged in the meditation room. They put their palms together and looked nervous. They kept chanting. In hundreds of dark temples at the foot of the mountain, countless monks in colorful cassocks sat cross-legged in front of the Buddha statue. They put their palms together and looked confused. They kept chanting. In the vast field at the bottom of the giant pit, millions of people knelt in the direction of the Xiankong temple. No matter they were dressed shabbily or wore gold and silver, they looked very pious and kept praying. Different positions in the Buddhist country would result in different clothes and different expressions. The strong practitioners of the Buddhist sect didn't need to sit in front of the Buddha statue, while the ordinary monks needed to rely on the Buddha to boost their courage. The strong ones looked calm, the strong ones looked determined, the weak ones looked nervous, and the confused monks didn't even know what was happening. The pious believers in the field also didn't know what was going on. However, their faith was the strongest. They didn't learn the sutra, but the effect of praying was the strongest. But no matter what kind of people they were chanting and praying. Bells, sutra sounds, and prayers were everywhere in the Buddha kingdom. The clouds were calm, and many traces gradually appeared. That was the shadow of the sutra in the clouds. The real sutra was in the air. Thousands of temple-sized characters glowed with a faint golden light. They floated over the heads of the herdsmen, the real temples, and the green trees on the cliffs. They kept arranging and combining in the sky. The dark field was brightly illuminated by these golden sutra. The believers kneeling in the field looked very excited. They became more pious, and their hearts to Buddha became firmer. Their prayers became more and more orderly and loud. Jun Mo, who stood quietly by a blue lake near the cliff, looked very special compared with the herdsman kneeling on the ground. His figure looked so lonely and powerful. He looked at the golden sutra flying toward the giant peak, and slightly raised his eyebrows. Thousands of golden sutra gathered from all directions, and slowly rotated around the giant peak. They illuminated the green trees and the temples, and the light of Buddha on the cliff yard became brighter. In the light of Buddha, Ning Ke held the handle of the umbrella tightly with his pale face. Sang Sang looked at the depths of the light of Buddha, and her face became paler and paler. But she still didn't make a move, because she wanted to see where the light of Buddha came from, and where Buddha was. Ning Ke looked at her back, and felt a little nervous. Although he didn't know the method of Xiankong temple chanting, nor did he know what the golden words in the sky meant, his talent in talisman Taoism was unparalleled. Intuitively, he guessed that if those golden words finally arranged into a Buddhist sutra, it would be difficult for Sang Sang to deal with the real attack of the Buddhism sect. So why didn't she make a move? Sang Sang looked up at the depths of the light of Buddha for a long time. Suddenly, She looked at the cliff yard under her feet and said, "I see." The mountain where Xiankong Temple was located was the tallest and largest mountain in the world. However, this mountain was always hidden in the giant sinkhole. From the surface, it was just an inconspicuous small mound. Its meaning was naturally consistent with Buddhism and Taoism, because this mountain was the tallest person in the world. But he didn't want to show up. This cliff yard was not a real cliff yard, but a palm open to the sky. The pear tree on the edge of the cliff was not a real tree, but a flower between the fingers of that person. That person was Buddha. Ning Kei and Sang Sang stood on the cliff yard, standing beside the pear tree. In fact, they were standing in the palm of Buddha, standing under the little white flower between his fingers. Sang Sang picked the little white flower on her temples and threw it into the wind. She looked at the top of the mountain and said sarcastically, "This mountain is just your corpse, not you. Do you want to trap me in your palm like this?" Yes, this mountain was not the Gautama Buddha, but the remains of the Gautama Buddha after his nirvanic rebirth. However, it was the remains of Buddha, the highest in the world. Who could escape from the palm of Buddha? Well, there is one more chapter. It will be published later. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 948. The mountain was the Buddha, and the cliff plateau was the Buddha's palm. The light of Buddha, which was full of silent power, did not come from the sky, but from the Buddha's palm, from the pious faith of countless monks and believers in Xiankong Temple, and the plain at the bottom of the pit. It was the same for the scriptures that lingered between the peaks. They were written by Buddha himself countless years ago, and sung by his disciples and believers devoutly after countless years. The Buddha's nature gilded the scriptures, and naturally, the Dharma of Buddha was boundless. Sang Sang quietly looked at the cliff plateau, the scriptures floating in the air, and the light of Buddha. She saw the Lank Temple in autumn a few years ago. That year, the Lank Temple also had such a silent light of Buddha. It came from the Buddha statue on the top of Tile Mountain, and started from the crisp bell in the hands of Baoshu, the president of Commandment Yard. This year, the light of Buddha in Xiankong Temple was still cold. It came from the cliff plateau, from the palm of Buddha's slough, and from the distant bell behind the treasure hall on the top of the peak. That year, the light of Buddha in Lank Temple was to kill the daughter of Yama. This year, the light of Buddha in Xiankong Temple was to suppress Haotian. Haotian was the daughter of Yama, and the light of Buddha was still the same. Everything was clear now. For the headmaster of academy, Haotian set up a trap for 1,000 years. Before that, Buddha had read the Ming hand scroll of the tomes of arcane and written notes. He knew what would happen in the future, and predicted that a bright moon would appear when the night came. However, he did not say that Haotian would come to the human world and become weaker and weaker. Therefore, Buddha also set up a trap. He left many celestial devices in the human world, such as the Yulan bell, the chessboard, and the light of Buddha to suppress the entrance to the underworld. However, how could Buddha not know that the underworld did not exist? From the beginning to the end, Buddha wanted to kill her. Buddha wanted to destroy Haotian. The Yulan bell was crushed into scrap iron by Junmo, and the Buddha statue on the top of Tile Mountain was chopped into pieces by Junmo. The chessboard was taken to the wilderness by Ning Kei and Sang Sang. However, the mountain transformed from the remains of Buddha was much taller than the stone statues on Hua Mountain. The bell of Xiankong Temple was much louder than the Yulan bell, and the light of Buddha was also much stronger. Sang Sang saw through everything. She and Ning Kei were telepathic, so Ning Kei naturally knew all the causes and effects. Only then did he know that the mountain where Xiankong Temple was located was actually the body of Buddha. He was shocked. No one could not be shocked at this moment. His face was pale, not only because he was too shocked, but also because the golden characters flying around the mountain peak had gradually found their order and were about to form a complete scripture. Each character was as big as a temple, and thousands of characters were a huge scripture. The golden scripture floated in the sky above Xiankong Temple, and even covered the clouds. With a clang, Ning-Ke held the hilt of the cutlass. The iron cutlass was half out of the sheath, and the cold light was threatening. Just as he was about to attack, Sang-Sang waved her sleeves. His green robe, which was covered in flowers, sparkled in the endless Buddhist light, like the most noble imperial robe. She was the king of this world. She waved her sleeves to the sky, and a gust of wind roared like a dragon, passing through the dense forests and temples between the peaks, and chopping down countless monks off the cliff. The wind came to the Mahavira Hall at the top of the peak. The ancient bell shook slightly, and the bell sounds were slightly chaotic. Grass was flying on the stone steps. Qin Yan and the other old monks closed their eyes, and were not afraid of being blinded. However, their Zen hearts were gradually becoming restless and confused, and blood seeped out of their mouths and noses. At this moment Chi Mei, who was in front of the Buddha statue in the hall, changed from kneeling to sitting. His expression was firm and determined. He held a wooden staff, and hit the wooden fish in front of him heavily. The wooden fish was instantly broken. Almost at the same time, the Vajra pestle held by the venerable beside the Buddha statue fell from the sky and hit Chi Mei's head heavily. With a puff, Chi Mei's skulls were all broken, and his brains and blood were scattered everywhere. Blood stains stained the Buddha statue. The Mahavira Hall, which was shaking in the gust of wind, suddenly stabilized and became one with the peak. The monks also finally stabilized their bodies and hearts. Sang-Sang waved her sleeves and created wind. It was the wind of heaven, so it would not be annihilated. It floated up from the top of the peak, and instantly came to the scripture composed of thousands of words in the sky. The clouds in the sky were chaotic, and the golden words under the clouds were scattered everywhere. In the golden light, the edges of the scripture that was about to take shape were messed up, and it was difficult to understand the content. Sang-Sang broke the scripture left by the Buddha by waving her sleeves, but her expression became solemn. Because she had a better understanding of the surrounding environment in the moment she waved her sleeves. She was puzzled to find that she actually could not take Ning-Ke away from the cliff plateau. The power of the Prohibition Cliff Plateau was not the rule, nor was it an ordinary cultivation method. Cultivation was still within the rule. Even the small world above the 5 states was still in the world of Haotian. In that case, even if she was much weaker after coming to the human world, she could still break the 3,000 worlds with a single thought. At this time they were trapped in a macro world. How could there be a real macro world in the world of Haotian? The Buddha turned his body into a mountain. There were countless temples on the mountain, and countless believers at the foot of the mountain. The mountain originally had no consciousness, no spirit, and no life. But for countless years, the temples on the mountain were filled with incense, the monks kept chanting, and the believers in the wilderness worshipped. Finally, the Buddha nature was cultivated. The Buddha nature was the consciousness of the monks and believers. After countless years, countless people, countless consciousnesses, and countless lives, the world finally became a Buddha land. The real Buddha land was the real world, the big world of the nirvana. This world was located in the far west of the human world, so it was called the Western Nirvana. Even if she was in the Western Nirvana, and could not leave easily, Sang-Sang did not care. She was Haotian, and even if she fought with millions, or even more Buddhism believers, she would not lose. However, she had been in the human world for a long time, and the power of the human world, that the headmaster poured into her body, was constantly weakening her. If she wanted to break the Western Nirvana, she would have to pay a great price. If the Western Nirvana was destroyed, there was still Chang'an City, the Academy, and the God-stunning array in the human world. Then how could she, who was extremely weak, do? So she hesitated. Ning-Ke did not know why she hesitated. The current situation was very bad. The Buddhist scripture that was blown away by the wind did not disappear, and the scattered parts fell to the cliff plateau. Those golden, monastery-sized characters gradually became smaller as they floated down to the plateau. Eventually, they turned into petal-like existences that exuded a strange fragrance. In the Buddha land, there were heavenly made scattering flowers, which was very beautiful. Ning-Ke's expression was very solemn. The petals changed from the scripture fell on the surface of the big black umbrella, and each petal was as heavy as a giant stone. The light of Buddha was already very powerful. Countless petals fell on the surface of the big black umbrella, which was even more unbearable for human beings. In an instant, he felt that his arm was about to break. Ning-Kei inserted the handle of the umbrella into the cliff plateau, believing that since the mountain was the body of Buddha, it must be able to withstand it. He glanced at Sang-Sang, who stood in silence in the light of Buddha. He pulled out the iron cutlass and chopped at the falling petals. The cutlass left a mark, and the mark was the word, and the word was the divine talisman, the E-talisman. The petals looked like petals, but they were actually words, words from the Buddhist scripture. The Dharma was incomparable, so the words were as heavy as a mountain. If Buddha had left some other means, Ning-Kei's cultivation state within the 5 states would not have been able to do anything. He could only grab Sang-Sang's sleeves and hide behind her. But since it was a scripture, and the falling words were words, he could break it. Because he was the best calligrapher, and the most powerful divine talisman master in the world. He had broken countless words in the old library of the academy, and he was best at breaking words in his life. 7 divine talismans of E appeared in the air by the cliff. The falling petals touched the talisman and broke into pieces, because the words in the flowers were broken into meaningless lines. The petals continued to fall. Thousands of words were thousands of flowers, like the spring rain, and it did not stop for a long time. The 7 divine talismans of E fought against the power of Buddha, but they did not last long and disappeared. Looking at the scripture that was still half broken in the air, the words that kept falling from the slightly messy scripture, and the petals that were near him, Ning-Kei was not afraid at all. He waved his blade again. This time, he did not break words, but wrote a word in the sky. He wrote it very casually, and even he did not know what it was. Even if Buddha could know for 500 years after his death, he could not guess it. The strokes of the iron cutlass on the scripture were more like graffiti. No matter how simple the scripture was, as long as a naughty boy scribbled on it, even the most knowledgeable monk could not understand the meaning of it. The scripture in the Buddhist land was broken by Ning-Kei's random chopping. He was a monster cultivated by the headmaster of academy in Yensei. He did not belong to the world of Haotian, or the world of Buddha. The last place he wanted to stay was the Western Nirvana. Using words to deal with Ning-Kei was like cutting fish in front of the headmaster of academy, or selling hot and sour noodle slice soup in front of Lin 47th Street. He sheathed his cutlass and looked at Sang-Sang, saying, "Why don't you do it?" Sang-Sang did not respond to him, thinking about something. Ning-Kei shook off the petals on the big black umbrella and put them on her head to block the light of Buddha for her. Sang-Sang frowned slightly and said, "You can't do anything to me with these tricks." Ning-Kei said, "Look at your pale face. Why do you have to be brave?" Sang-Sang said, "I am strong. Why do I have to be brave?" Ning-Kei thought that Haotian cared too much about his face, and still had to be brave at this time. He put the handle of the umbrella into her hand, looked at the peak and shouted, "Let's give up. Can we stop fighting?" Sang-Sang frowned again, and was a little unhappy. Ning-Kei said seriously, "Look at me. I never know what face is." Xiankong Temple knew that Haotian would not give up, so he would not either. What answered Ning-Kei was the sound of bells all over the mountain and cliffs, endless solemn chanting, and a voice. "Since we are fighting with heaven, why should the academy stand on heaven's side?" This voice was quiet and majestic. If one listened carefully, it could only be described as magnificent. And what it asked was the most fundamental question, which was difficult for anyone to answer. Hearing this, Ning-Kei laughed happily. "Chief monk, you should still be buried in the ground now, but you are still so energetic. It is really admirable." It was not difficult to write 5 chapters yesterday. What was difficult was that after writing 5 chapters yesterday, I wrote another 10,000 words today. I'm already full of admiration for myself. I don't have any other requests. I just hope that everyone can give me more recommendation votes. Today, the moderator Dream Chaser Help me calculate that this Sunday's Nightfall needs 28,000 recommendation votes. I'm still short of 10,000. Please support me. Nightfall and the book review section need your help. Thank you. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 949. Ninkei's laughter was extremely joyful and heroic. It flew out from the edge of the cliff, passed through the green pear blossoms, drifted over the Buddha's light and withered scripture petals, and echoed among countless temples. Even the chanting of millions of people, and the distant bell, that seemed to come from ancient times could not suppress it. Ever since he became invincible in the human world during the right to light, he had been tortured countless times by Sang Sang. When he took Sang Sang on the journey, she was always the one to take action. When she took action, he could only stand behind pitifully. How could he have a chance to take action? It seemed that he had defeated the master of calligraphy in the palace of the capital city, but in fact, it was because of her strength. In the end, he was reduced to carrying a load, leading a horse, and doing some sewing, mending and washing work. But today, in the face of the boundless Buddha light and the falling flowers, Sang Sang was suppressed. He took out his iron knife and wrote several talismans to break the power of Buddha. How could he not feel refreshed? The chief monk's voice sounded again in the Buddha's light. Buddhism wanted to kill her back then, and you helped her. Now you are still helping her. Why? Has the academy betrayed the will of the headmaster? Ninkei said, the academy's defiance of nature is the academy's business. She is my wife. Even if there is a problem between us, it should be a conflict within our family. What is the Buddha doing? After hiding for so many years, he jumped out to take advantage of the couple when they weren't paying attention. Disgusting. The chief monk said, karma, karma and karma. Ultimately, it all depends on the result. Ninkei said, if the Buddha's karma is to turn the human world into the world at the foot of the mountain, then the academy will definitely not let his karma come true. The chief monk asked seriously, why? Ninkei said, because it's disgusting. The chief monk remained silent. Ninkei was in high spirits and would not stop there. He said loudly, Buddha is merciful? Among the tens of thousands of monks in Xiankong Temple, is there anyone who has the face to say where is this compassion? The chief monk said indifferently, then you go with Haoyan. Ninkei said, your pretentious look reminds me of me in the past. It's disgusting indeed. Holding the big black umbrella, Sang Sang looked at Ninkei and said, you are quite disgusting now. Ninkei said helplessly, understand your position and position, okay? At this moment, the great Buddhist scripture in the sky was still scattered into countless flower petals and fell down. It no longer emitted a strange fragrance, nor was it as powerful as before, but it was still extremely dangerous. The chief monk stopped talking, but there were still many people talking. Countless believers in the temples and fields at the foot of the peak kept chanting or praying. The light of Buddha on the cliff plateau gradually grew brighter. The Buddha had left countless foreshadowing for Haoyan, which was as vast as the sea. How could Ninkei solve it? And the most dangerous celestial device was still in the human world. It rained in Chaoyang City. The 72 monasteries looked solemn and dignified in the drizzle. When the bell rang in the Xiankong Temple in the depths of western wilderness, the bell rang in all 72 temples at the same time. The bell rang in every street and alley in the city, echoing in the hearts of all believers. The Buddhist bell could clear one's mind and alert one's mind. Whether it was the old woman in the alley, or the young emperor in the palace, they all came to the temples under the guidance of the bell. All the Buddhist temples in Chaoyang City were crowded with believers. Men and women, young and old, knelt in front of the Buddha statue and kept kowtowing and praying. The White Tower Temple was even more so. The stone plateau in front of the lake was full of believers. The lake was very clean and calm. The beautiful white tower and weeping willows were reflected on the lake, which was the most famous scenery in Chaoyang City. It was the best memory for people living here. The autumn wind blew and the lake rippled. The white tower reflected on the lake gradually became distorted. This was a very common scene. But the believers who kept praying by the lake were extremely shocked. Because as the reflection of the white tower in the lake was distorted, the real white tower by the lake was also distorted. The tower shadow was an illusion. How could it affect the real white tower? The autumn wind gradually became stronger, whistling over the lake and shaking the lake. The tower shadow and the tree shadow on the lake were all crushed into pieces and could no longer be seen clearly. The white tower by the lake gradually became illusory, as if it was about to disappear in the air. The lake trembled more and more violently. The foaming waves looked like the clouds in the sky, or the water in a pot of boiling water. The reflection of the white tower turned into foam and finally disappeared. There was a loud bang. The lake suddenly disappeared, leaving only the dry lake bottom. The white tower by the lake was also gone. The white tower had accompanied the believers of Yueluan Kingdom for countless years. It had long become their spiritual belief or life memory. But today it just disappeared in front of them. Everyone who saw this had a feeling that they would never see the return of the white tower. The most famous scenery in Chaoyang City would never be reborn again. The believers were shocked and sad. They didn't know what to think at this time. They only knew that they could kneel by the lake and keep kowtowing and praying to the bottom altar of the white tower. They were even more pious than before. The sky above Xiankang Temple was always covered by thick clouds. Since Buddha wanted to destroy Haotian, he naturally couldn't let her see the clear sky. All of a sudden, an extremely terrifying sound of wind rang out from high up in the sky. The center of the clouds suddenly bulged to the ground for hundreds of feet. The bulging clouds were about to touch the top of the giant peak. Thunder and lightning flashed at the bottom, and then rain fell. This was not real rain, but the lake in the White Tower Temple from countless miles away in the human world. There were even many swimming fish and broken lotus branches in it. The heavy rain poured down, and the bulging clouds suddenly split open. A white tower broke out of the clouds and fell on the cliff plateau between the peaks. The white tower also came from countless miles away in the human world. With the awareness of all the believers of Buddha in the human world, it broke the space and came to the western Pure Land to suppress Haotian under the tower. In the autumn several years ago, the chief monk of scripture had thought of suppressing Sangsang under the White Tower. Several years later in this autumn, the means left by Buddha finally made this scene a reality. The heavy rain fell on the cliff plateau, and the branches of the pear trees drooped. However, the small green pears in the green leaves didn't fall to the ground. Countless water flowed down the cliff edge and formed a thin waterfall. Holding the black umbrella, Sangsang stood in the middle of the heavy rain, still looking calm. Ningke didn't have an umbrella, so he was instantly soaked by the rain. Several lotus branches like dead snakes hung on his shoulders, and a slippery loach crawled into his arms. He looked very embarrassed. What really made him feel uneasy was not the lake, but the white tower that broke out of the clouds. The bulging part of the clouds was very close to the peak, so the white tower soon passed the Mahavira Hall on the peak and unwaveringly suppressed the cliff plateau where he and Sangsang were. The white tower that fell from the sky contained the supreme power of Buddha, and the light of Buddha on the cliff plateau also became stronger. There was a vague connection between the two that couldn't be broken. The cliff plateau was the palm of the Buddha's body. When the white tower fell, it would fall into the palm of the Buddha, because it was the most powerful instrument left by the Buddha in the human world. Ningke didn't mind that the Buddha wanted to take back his treasure, but he and Sangsang were standing in the palm of the Buddha and couldn't leave. When the white tower fell, they would be suppressed. Then how could they turn the situation around? The white tower fell, and the power of Buddha approached. Ningke held the iron cutlass and looked around blankly. He didn't know how to deal with it. He turned his head and saw that the woman was still in a daze under the umbrella. He spat out a mouthful of blood. After wiping the blood from the corner of his mouth, the woman was still in a daze. Ningke was helpless and in great pain. He shouted at her, "Oh my God! Why are you still in a daze at this time? Hurry up and use your divine ability." Sangsang raised her head and looked at the white tower that was falling in the light of Buddha. The heavy rain suddenly stopped, and the clouds were suddenly quiet. The falling of the White Tower suddenly slowed down, as if it was suspended in the air. It just slowed down but didn't really stop. No matter how slow it was, as long as it didn't stop falling, the White Tower would fall on the cliff plateau one day and press her and Ning Ke under the tower. To get rid of the current situation, they had to leave the cliff plateau. To leave the cliff plateau, they had to forcibly break the big world composed of the light of Buddha, scriptures, and the awareness of millions of believers. Buddha's Western paradise. Sang Sang was not willing to pay such a high price, because there was still the academy in the human world. She clasped her hands behind her back and looked at the White Tower in the air expressionlessly, thinking quietly. Seeing her like this, Ning Ke was very helpless. He waved the iron cutlass to cut the number of scriptures floating in front of the cliff and rushed to her side. He squeezed into the big black umbrella and shouted in her ear, "Wake up!" Song Song's expression didn't change. She said, "I'm not asleep now." Ning Ke said, "Think of a way quickly. I don't want to be Su Xian." Sang Sang said, "It's the white snake under the tower." Ning Ke was very annoyed and said, "If you become the white snake, can I still stay outside the tower?" Sang Sang looked at the White Tower and said, "I've been weakened by your academy. I can't break this tower." Ning Ke said, "So it's my responsibility?" "Well, even if it's my responsibility, you are Haotian. You must have some treasures with you, right?" Sang Sang looked at him and pointed to the big black umbrella. Ning Ke was very dissatisfied and said, "Look at how many treasures Buddha left. You only left this broken umbrella?" He emphasized the word broken. The big black umbrella was indeed broken now, but if it could perceive, it would feel very wronged. Sang Sang didn't feel wronged, because only weak human beings would feel wronged. She said, "Only the weak would make so many preparations. I don't need anything in the human world." In her view, Buddha was the weak one. Ning Ke said, "The weak one you said is about to suppress you, the strong one." Sang Sang looked at him and said, "Do you think Buddha can defeat me with these methods?" Ning Ke said, "I'm watching this tragedy happen." Sang Sang said, "Whimsical." Ning Ke said, "Isn't he thinking about opening the sky? If I say it can't be opened, then it can't be opened." She suddenly looked at the luggage behind Ning Ke and the chessboard left by Buddha. She said expressionlessly, "Because I am Haotian, and you are nothing." This is the only chapter for today. I'm a little tired. Are you surprised? Well, I'm not kidding. This is indeed the only chapter for today. I watched a movie with my wife. I'm a little happy and tired. I came back a little late. Tomorrow will be a big hit. A big hit. I'm good at this rhythm. In fact, the most important thing in life is to be happy. Seeing that Ning Ke and his wife are still so happy in such an environment, I also hope that everyone can read happily and be happy in all kinds of ways. If anyone is unhappy, it's all my fault. Just blame me. Everyone, please give me some recommendation votes to make me and the moderators happy. Thank you. See you tomorrow. There will be a big hit. It's definitely not a lie. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 950. After saying that, Song Song's aura suddenly changed. She was still standing on the cliff platform, under the pear tree, right beside Ning Ke, sharing the same umbrella. However, in Ning Ke's eyes, she seemed to have suddenly become many times taller, as if she was about to touch the sky and look down at the White Tower in the sky. Facing the Buddha's most powerful means, she responded with the immeasurability of the Buddhism sect. Ning Ke had seen the Abidin's immeasurability and the drunkard's immeasurability. Only her immeasurability was truly immeasurability. The Xiankong temple felt her change. The bells all over the cliff and the chanting in countless temples did not stop. Instead, they became louder and louder with the change of her aura. Every word of the sutra chanted by the monks in the temple was as heavy as the temple itself. Rocks from the east and west peaks gradually fell, The bodies of the tens of thousands of monks shook uneasily. Blood gushed out of their mouths, but they still chanted the sutra. Ning Ke found that Song Song's face was a little pale, and could not help but worry. Sang Sang knew what he was thinking and said calmly, "This is my world. No one can trap me." However, this was the Buddha kingdom, a very big world. As the bells of the Xiankong temple rang, the bells of the 72 temples in Chaoyang City rang at the same time in the autumn rain. The bells of the Lank temple on the Hua Mountain, which was far away by the sea, began to ring. The bells of the Wanyan Tower temple in Chang'an did not ring. The Red Lotus temple, which had long been in ruins, only had a deformed bell, which began to ring in the autumn wind, like the crying of ghosts. There was a shabby nunnery outside the capital of the Yin kingdom, which had been abandoned for many years. Since last year, more than a dozen widowed and childless women were driven out of their homes by their families. Their land and houses were taken away. The women gathered in the shabby nunnery. They used tiles to shave off their hair that had not yet turned gray. Accompanied by the broken lamps and broken Buddha statues, they were hopelessly prepared to spend the rest of their lives there, or they would suddenly die in the hands of bandits one night. Today, they suddenly heard the sound of a bell ringing in the distance. The women had lost all hope after being tortured by the cold and cruel life, but the sound of the bell seemed to have injected some kind of power into their bodies. They stood up and ran to the broken bell at the back of the nunnery. They clenched their fists and kept hitting the surface of the bell until their fists bled. It seemed that they wanted to vent all the resentment and despair they had accumulated over the years through the sound of the bell, so that they could find comfort in their next life. The sound from the broken clock was hoarse and unpleasant, as if they were crying loudly. In Chaoyang City, countless monks knelt in front of the Buddha statue and kept chanting sutras. Countless believers knelt in front of the lake and the white tower that had disappeared and kept praying to Buddha. In the Wanyan Tower temple in Chang'an, the monks were stunned to hear the bell ringing behind the courtyard. The stone statues seemed to come alive. In the Lank temple on Hua Mountain, the abbot monk Guanhai looked solemn. He knelt in silence before the stone statue of Buddha on the peak. In the city and countryside, all the people who had been helped by the ascetic monks, no matter old women or children, knelt devoutly in the omnipresent sound of the bell and kept praying to Buddha. The bell, the chanting of sutras, and the sound of prayer rang in every corner of the human world. The human world was the Buddhist kingdom. As long as people believed in Buddha, they would enter the big world he left behind. The Western Pure Land. Song Song's face became paler and paler. She had underestimated the power of Buddha, but she was not flustered. Since these were all arranged by Buddha, Buddha must not be dead. Then as long as she found Buddha and killed him, the pure land that Buddha had set up in the human world would naturally be destroyed. All these methods would become illusions and no longer exist. And she had already found out where Buddha was. Ning Ke looked at her face and was very worried. Sang Sang suddenly turned to look at him and said, "Eat the green pear in your sleeve." Ning Ke was stunned. There was indeed a green pear in his sleeve. It was the first fruit from the pear tree by the cliff. But why did she want him to eat the green pear now? Soon he thought he understood what Sang Sang meant. Just like under the statue of Buddha on Hua Mountain and in Master Chishan's cave, he could enter Buddha's chessboard as long as he ate the green pear. Could he leave Buddha's Western Pure Land by entering the chessboard? Ning Ke trusted Sang Sang very much. It had nothing to do with the relationship between husband and wife, but because she was Haotian and could calculate everything in the world. However, he could not help but hesitate at this moment. After eating the green pear last time, it was only their consciousness or souls that entered the chessboard, but their bodies were still outside. Even if Sang Sang used her great power to let their bodies and souls enter the chessboard at the same time, what kind of danger would there be in the chessboard? He looked at the chessboard taken out from his luggage and at the blurry lines on it. He had a terrible guess. What if Buddha was hiding in the chessboard? There is no what if. Buddha is in the chessboard. Sang Sang put away the big black umbrella and looked at the scripture petals falling from the sky. She looked at the light of Buddha that appeared between the cliff plateau and enveloped her and Ning Quebec. She looked at the slowly falling white tower and said, "When I came to this mountain, Xiankong Temple was quiet and Buddha was speechless. Because I am Haotian, how dare they touch me?" Ning Ke asked confusedly, "Then why do they touch me now?" Sang Sang looked at him and said, "Because the pear on the tree was ripe and you picked it." Ning Ke looked at the small green pear in his right hand and the chessboard in his left hand. He vaguely understood something. Back then, Lang Temple was full of powerhouses, and second brother destroyed the Buddha's instrument and Dharma statue. Only the chessboard was still silent. Now he thought about it. There was indeed something wrong. When the green pear was ripe, we could enter the chessboard and see the real body of Buddha. The monks in the mountain began to fear, and so did Buddha. So they risked their 10,000 years of foundation to stop us. Why didn't I see Buddha when I entered the chessboard in Lang Temple? I didn't wake up at that time, so I couldn't see him. And it was meaningless for him to see me. Meaningless? Was Buddha also waiting to see you as Haotian? Yes. Sang Sang looked at the chessboard in his hand and thought, no wonder I couldn't find any trace of Buddha in the human world. And no wonder the heart of heaven always fell on Ning Ke's side when I looked around in Xiankong Temple. It's not that I can't leave this man, but that I have long noticed that Buddha is hiding in the chessboard. That's good. Ning Ke felt that the chessboard in his hand suddenly became very heavy. Anyone who knew that he was holding the world after Buddha's nirvana, or the Buddha's coffin, would have the same feeling. We know that Buddha is inside, but we still want to go in? He was a little uneasy. Sang Sang said, I came to kill Buddha, and I know where Buddha is. Of course I have to go. Ning Ke was about to say something, when he suddenly felt something in his mouth. Then, the sweet and delicious pear juice flowed down his throat, and into his stomach. That green pear was eaten by him. What was done could not be undone. The rice had become porridge, and the pear had fallen into his stomach. What had already happened could not be changed. He quickly accepted this cruel reality, and walked towards the green tree by the cliff. What are you going to do? Sang Sang asked. Ning Ke reached out to pick the pear and said, You haven't eaten it yet. Sang Sang said, I don't need it. I have been in this chessboard, and the chessboard is also my world. After saying this, there was a chess piece between her fingers. A few years ago, in Lank Mountain, she and Master Chishan played the last game of the 3 games of chess on Hua Mountain. The master asked her to choose a chess piece, and she did not hesitate to choose a black chess piece, which made the master sigh with emotion. 2 years ago in the wilderness, the chess piece in her hand had changed from black to white. The headmaster in the carriage saw this scene, and the world changed. The headmaster knew all the causes and effects, and began to take her and Ning Ke on the long journey in the human world, to make arrangements for Haotians coming to the human world. That chess piece had been in Song Song's hand, but now it was hard to tell what color it was. It seemed to be black and white, and it kept changing at will, as if it was the will of heaven. Ning Ke looked at the chess piece in her hand and thought of many things. He silently leveled the chessboard. She put the chess piece on the chessboard. There was no sound and no wind blew. Ning Ke and Song Song's figures disappeared from the cliff plateau. The chessboard stayed in the air for a moment, and then fell on the cliff plateau, splashing a few drops of rain. A few drops of rain flowed out of the cliff, and turned into several large waterfalls, making a thunderous sound in the valley. Without the obstruction of the power of heaven, the white tower from Chaoyang City whistled through the air, and fell heavily on the chessboard. With a loud bang, it was shaken to the old temple behind the cliff. The old temple was shattered into ruins, and the road to the cliff cave was blocked by the white tower. The chessboard bounced on the cliff plateau for a few times, and then it stopped, raising a very gentle wind. As the wind blew, the green trees by the cliff kept shaking, and countless small green pears fell. Before the white tower broke through the clouds, thousands of hectares of lake water came from Chaoyang City and washed the cliff plateau like a rainstorm. However, it could not knock down a single green pear. At this time, these green pears fell with the wind like rain. Clap, clap, clap. In the noisy rain-like sounds, the green pears fell, and fell on the cliff plateau softened by the rainwater. They were instantly shaken into juice, leaving only hundreds of pear pits. The pear pits were blown by the wind, fell along the waterfalls, and fell into the abyss at the foot of the mountain, never to be found again. This pear tree was planted by Buddha himself. It bloomed every 500 years, bore fruit every 5 days, and fell to the ground every 5 minutes. The pear fell to the ground and drifted with the current, never to be seen again. There were only 3 green pears left in Xiankong Temple for countless years. When Master Qishan left Xiankong Temple, he brought all 3 green pears to the human world. Because he was the illegitimate son of the chief preaching monk of that generation, he was not punished. The first green pear was used by Master Qishan to save tens of thousands of victims of the plague after the flood of South Jin Kingdom. Because of this, his Zen heart was backfired, and he lost all his state and became a useless person. The second green pear was used by Master Qishan to enlighten Master Lotus, who lived in the temple. Lotus was born beside the pear tree by the cliff of Xiankong Temple, meditating on Tao. It had to be said that it was fate or Buddha's fate. The third green pear was eaten by Sang Sang and Ning Ke, which let the master know Song Song's identity. From then on, a bloody journey began in the human world. 500 years later, the green pear tree in Xiankong Temple bloomed and bore hundreds of green fruits. Only one survived, and it was eaten by Ning Quebec. But this time, the matter to be decided was relatively simple. This green pear would decide life and death. The life and death of Haotian and Buddha. This is the first chapter. There will definitely be more today. Yesterday, I said that I would break out, so I must work hard. But I have to write it carefully. My hands are a little tired, so my speed will be slower. I will continue to work hard. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 951. There was a gentle breeze on the cliff plateau. The white tower was built between the broken temple and the messy eaves. It was not as dazzling as it was by the lake in Chaoyang City, which was admired and loved by thousands of people. It was so dim that it felt decadent. Countless leaves fell from the heavy rain, and hundreds of fruits fell from the wind. The branches of the green trees by the cliff were scattered like a naked woman. The waterfall at the bottom of the cliff seemed to be laughing at it loudly. The chessboard was lying in the rain on the cliff plateau. The clouds covering the vault of heaven had dispersed, and the light of Buddha on the cliff platform had disappeared. The scriptures glowing with golden light had dispersed with the clouds. There were no more petals falling down. The bells and the chanting of scriptures in the temple had also stopped. The monks walked out of the temples in the Xiankong Temple and looked at the cliff plateau above. They felt uneasy and gradually calmed down. They returned to their temples and resumed their daily homework. The bells of countless temples in the world had also stopped ringing. The elders and abbots in the temples looked at the Buddha statue and were speechless. Suddenly, a welcoming monk came to report that a princess or a prince had come to offer incense. The elders and abbots all changed their expressions when they heard this. They put on the appearance of an enlightened monk and moved forward to welcome them. They were secretly thinking how much incense money they should collect today. Of course, they should not show too much of their worldly aura in case the nobles would be unhappy. They did not remember who the Buddha was at this moment. Countless believers in the human world also woke up. They rubbed their bruised foreheads and looked around in panic. They did not know what had happened. An old woman suddenly heard her grandson crying. She looked back and saw her grandson rolling off the bed with a bruise that was very similar to hers on his forehead. She could not help but panic. She hurriedly climbed up with her sore and numb body. She held her grandson in her arms and kept comforting him. She kicked the ground and said that it was the fault of the land. She did not remember who the Buddha was at this moment. In the shabby nunnery outside the capital of Yan Kingdom, the women looked at the broken bell, which did not make a sound no matter how hard they hit it. They looked terrified. Could it be that they could not hear the bell anymore? Suddenly, they began to cry loudly. Even if they could get more blessings in the next life, how could they live such a miserable life in this life? In a daze, They walked back to the room covered with straw, knelt down with their palms together, and prayed to Buddha. In the wilderness at the bottom of the giant sinkhole, millions of people kneeling on the ground woke up one after another. When the nobles found themselves kneeling together with the untouchables, they couldn't help but feel very angry. They waved the whips in their hands, and drew more than a dozen bloodstains on the bodies of several serfs, before they felt a little better. The serfs were whipped more than a dozen times and were in great pain, but they did not dare to resist. They supported their tired bodies to work until late at night. After eating terrible food, they began to pray to Buddha before going to bed, silently praying that the merciful Buddha would guide them to the Western paradise as soon as possible. Most of the time, the beliefs of the human world were like this. Whether it was the Buddha or Haotian, they were easily forgotten. Of course, sometimes it was also very difficult to forget. Happy people tend to forget their faith, which is the last hope of the unfortunate. From this point of view, faith may be good, but at the same time it means bad. Perhaps because of this, there was such a group of non-believers in the back of the mountain of the academy. There were many people who could understand this, but because of their position and standpoint, they could not and did not dare to express their opinions on this issue. Master Huang Yang walked out of the meditation room and listened to the chanting coming from the top of the mountain. He felt the tranquility from countless temples and found that nothing had happened here. In fact, many things had happened. Sang Sang and Ning Ke entered the chessboard by themselves. But in the eyes of the Xiankong temple, it was naturally Buddha who put Haotian and her attendants into the chessboard with the supreme Dharma and was purifying them. Master Huang Yang's monk robe fluttered in the wind. He went straight up the mountain road and was about to reach the cliff plateau. He was going to pick up the chessboard because Ning Ke was in it. Ning Ke was too important to the Tang Empire, and he could not watch him die. Master Huang Yang was an eminent monk of the Buddhism sect, but first of all, he was a Tang man. At this moment, a quiet and majestic voice came from afar. As I have heard, there is a mountain named Prajna, and it is 108,000 times heavier than Tianqi Mountain. The voice came from the distant cliff ground, from the chief preaching monk. This was the supreme Dharma of the Buddhism sect. Words obey. Years ago in the White Tower Temple in Chaoyang City, the chief preaching monk told the eldest brother about this scripture. This scripture described a mountain named Prajna. The giant peak where the Xiankong temple was located was Prajna. As the Buddha's words were spoken, the cliff echoed and responded. The majestic Prajna mountain suddenly became heavier. Master Huang Yang, who was flying on the mountain road, suddenly stopped. With a crack, Master Huang Yang's leg bones were all broken. He was seriously injured by the mountain itself. Above the cliff on the edge of the giant sinkhole, the chief preaching monk's body was still buried in the ground. Only his head was above the ground. His two white eyebrows drooped in the dust, and his face was pale and weak. The chief preaching monk was integrated into the earth by Sang Sang. These days, he had been struggling under the endless pressure of the earth, and was already exhausted. Now he had to use the words obey, which made him even more exhausted. A gust of autumn wind blew, and the faint fragrance of wine spread in the wind of the wilderness. The drunkard, who was still wearing a scholar's gown, appeared in front of the chief preaching monk's head. The drunkard did not look at the chief preaching monk's funny face, but stared at the cliff plateau between the giant peaks. His face was very pale, and his eyes were full of fear and anxiety. The chief preaching monk looked up at him with difficulty and said, "It seems that you already know what happened." The drunkard looked terrible and said, "Such a big movement. The whole human world knows about it. Even if I want to pretend that I don't know, how can I?" When the bell and scripture were ringing everywhere in the human world, he had been in the small town between Yen and Song. However, even though he was with the butcher, he still felt very uneasy, and drank tea with Mr. Chow for a long time. "I didn't expect that you really dared to attack Haotian," the drunkard murmured. The chief preaching monk said slowly, "This is the arrangement of the Buddha." The drunkard looked at the small crack under the chief preaching monk's neck, picked up a stone, and threw it in. The crack between the chief preaching monk's neck and the ground expanded instantly. That was because the stone was expanding inside, which was the immeasurable state of the Buddhism sect. After a while, the chief preaching monk climbed out from the ground. His Buddha's body that had reached the Vajra body did not have any scars, but his kasaya and the monk's staff had been crushed into powder by the ground. He stood in the autumn wind in the wilderness, naked, and did not look like a senior monk of the Buddhism sect at all. The chief preaching monk took a piece of clothing from the drunkard and said, "You learned the immeasurable Dharma from the Buddha years ago, and I used it to get out. Now that I think about it, it's all because of the fate of Buddha." The drunkard said, "This is the world of Haotian, and the fate of Buddha is unpredictable. If she did not go to the chessboard, I would not be able to pull you out from the ground. So it's not the fate of Buddha, but the fate of heaven." The chief preaching monk said, "From today on, there is no fate of heaven, only fate of Buddha." The drunkard said, "I really don't know where your confidence comes from." The chief preaching monk said, "Follow me." The two left the cliff and came to the cliff plateau between the giant peaks. The chief preaching monk looked at the dilapidated pear tree and said after a long silence, "This tree was planted by the Buddha himself. The pear means separation, which means separation from the human world." The drunkard said seriously, "It blooms every 500 years. Has Haotian been gone for 500 years? The chief preaching monk said, "I don't know the age of the tree. Haotian can never return to the human world." The drunkard slightly raised his eyebrows and said, "If Haotian kills the Buddha, she can naturally return." The chief preaching monk said calmly, "The Buddha has reached nirvana. How can he be killed?" The drunkard frowned. Until now, no one knew whether the Buddha was alive or dead. This giant peak named Prajna was transformed from the Buddha's body. Then where was the Buddha's consciousness? The chief preaching monk knelt down to the chessboard in the rain and praised, "The Buddha knows the past and future for 5,000 years. He is not in the Xiankong temple, or the Buddha's body. The Buddha is in this small chessboard. He has waited for Haotian for 5,000 years, and finally met him today. How wise and merciful he is." The drunkard looked a little confused. If the consciousness of the Buddha was indeed in the chessboard, why did the chief preaching monk say that Haotian couldn't be destroyed? What was nirvana? Looking at the ordinary chessboard, he pondered for a long time, but still got nothing. This chessboard was the battlefield where the Buddha waited for Haotian. Unless the headmaster returned to the human world, no one could enter it. No one was qualified to participate in it, not even the drunkard. It was worth thinking that when Haotian entered the chessboard, there was another person beside him. Indeed, no one could enter the chessboard, but that person had entered the chessboard in advance. How would he affect the war? The drunkard said, "There is a problem." The chief preaching monk said, "What problem?" The drunkard said, "There is a person. In addition to heaven and Buddha, there was also a person on the chessboard." The chief monk said calmly, "Although Ning Kei's state has improved quite fast, he is only in the knowing destiny state. How could he be qualified to participate in such a high-level event?" The knowing destiny state was the peak of the 5 states of cultivation. However, the chief monk of scripture and the drunkard were powerhouses who had surpassed the 5 states, so they did not care. Even they could not touch the battle of heaven and Buddha, let alone Ning Quebec. The drunkard said sternly, "Even if he can't influence what happens in the chessboard, he can influence the world outside the chessboard. How can the academy ignore him when he is in the chessboard?" The academy had eldest brother and 23-year cicada cultivation, 2 powerhouses who had surpassed the 5 states, and Jun Mo, who no one knew how powerful he would be if he got angry. If these people knew that the Buddhism sect trapped Ning Kei in the chessboard, what would they do? What would they do? Will Jun Mo flip out? The chief monk said with a smile, "Didn't the Abbey Dean ask you to deliver the message because he predicted today's situation?" No one knew where Sang Sang and Ning Kei were at this moment, not even they themselves. Looking at the familiar streets and the people's clothes, they were silent for a long time. Ning Ke was so lost in thought that he even forgot to close the big black umbrella. There were many shrines along the streets, in which there were statues of Buddha and Venerable. The smell of spices filled the air, including spices for food and incense for the Buddha. The passers-by looked very happy. He and Sang Sang entered the chessboard, but they found themselves in Chaoyang City. What's going on? You ask me, but who should I ask? Ning Ke looked at Sang Sang and sighed. Of course you should ask Buddha. Sang Sang put her hands behind her back and walked to the street. She said, then we have to find him first. Chapter 2. My wife and I went to walk the dog and took a break. Chapter 3. Try to get out before 1 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chitian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 952. Suddenly, a bell rang in a temple not far away from the street. Ning Ke was folding his umbrella. He was tortured by the bell in Xiankong Temple. Hearing the bell again, he was shocked and grabbed Song Song's hand. Sang Sang looked at him with no emotion in her eyes. Then Ning Ke remembered that he had left Xiankong Temple. He let go of her hand in embarrassment and put his hand behind his back like she did. The bell in Chaoyang City was ringing louder and louder, and all the temples were ringing. Ning Ke could clearly hear that the loudest bell came from the north of the city, which should be the ancient bell in White Tower Temple. Some pedestrians were eating starch jelly, some were eating pilaf with banana leaves, and some were watching monkey shows. Hearing the bell, they put down what they were doing and walked to the nearest temple. Some people could not leave, so they knelt on the street and kept praying with their palms put together. The monkey show man also knelt on the ground in fear and trepidation. He even pressed the naughty monkey to the ground and kowtowed. Only Ning Ke and Sang Sang were left standing. Although the devout followers of the Buddhism sect did not look at them with hostility, they could not help but feel puzzled. The changes brought about by the bell were actually very cute, like some kind of flash mob that Ning Ke had seen in that world. The little monkey that was gently pressed by its owner kept rolling its eyes, which was also very cute. But Ning Ke suddenly felt a little disgusted, because he had seen the tragic world under the Xiankong Temple. Sang Sang hated these scenes even more. She gently flicked her sleeves. With a light brush, flowers bloomed on the green sleeves. A gust of wind rose on the street, blowing away the starch jelly stall, and blowing away the rice grains on the banana leaves. Many people were blinded by the wind. The man who was playing the monkey tried to rub his eyes, but he forgot to grab the rope. The little monkey, who had regained its freedom, ran out immediately. It didn't run too far away. It just looked for the fragrant and spicy rice grains among the flying banana leaves and ate happily. The bell of the temple on the street was also blown by the gust of wind, and the rhythm of the bell became messy. The wind did not stop and went up to the sky, messing up the clouds over Chaoyang City. Sang Sang was somewhat satisfied and continued to walk forward with her hands behind her back. Looking at her back, Ning Ke fell silent. When she was in the West Hill Divine Palace, she did not need to do anything. She did not even have to think about it. She only needed to feel a little uneasy, and stars would appear and disappear in her eyes. Countless clouds would appear from thousands of miles away and thunder, and lightning would appear on the top of Peach Mountain. However, after leaving the West Hill, especially after entering the depths of the wilderness, she began to flick her sleeves when she was in a fight or when she was angry. Song Song's divine might was still far beyond the scope of human imagination. But compared to the once omnipotent Sang Sang, she had indeed become much weaker. Ning Ke was a little uneasy, but he could not say anything. The reason why she was getting weaker was because the headmaster had left the power of the human world in her body. It was because of the long and happy journey 2 years ago. But now that he thought about it, it was such a dangerous journey. More importantly, it was because he took her to walk in the human world and did not let her go back. The streets were filled with smoke and dust blown by the wind. The smoke and dust were full of the smell of spices, and it was a little choking. Perhaps it was because the people here were used to it since they were young, but there was no sound of coughing. Walking in the smoke, and dust was also walking on the old road. Ning Ke and Sang Sang had lived in this city for a long time. He once fled here with her on his back. Many streets and alleys were left with his footprints and blood stains of the people he killed. However, after nearly 3 years, those bloodstains had long disappeared. It seemed incredible to enter the chessboard on the cliff plateau of Xiankong Temple and come out in Chaoyang City. In fact, there was only one possibility. Just like in Leng Temple, there was also a space passage between Xiankong Temple and Chaoyang City, and this chessboard was the key to open the space passage. Back then, Ning Ke and Sang Sang came directly from Leng Temple in the southeast to Xiankong Temple in the depths of the western wilderness. Today they came directly from Xiankong Temple to Chaoyang City. At this time, the two of them were walking in Chaoyang City. It seemed that they were naturally looking for the traces of Buddha. However, both Sang Sang and Ning Ke were very clear that Buddha could not be in this city. In the human world, it was impossible to hide from Hao Yan's eyes. Ning Ke did not point this out, nor did Sang Sang. It seemed that the two of them were really looking for Buddha. Since they were looking for him, it would naturally take time. Let's find a place to stay first, and then slowly look for him, he said. Sang Sang did not speak. Her silence meant that she agreed. If she wanted to object, she would speak directly or cut Ning Ke into pieces to show her attitude. In a noisy block in the north of the city, there was a very quiet and even deathly courtyard. It was the small courtyard that the two of them used to live in. Several years had passed, but no one had come to visit it. Pushing open the courtyard door, the small courtyard was still so quiet. The black cloth that Ning Ke used to cover the window was still hanging, but it was covered with a lot of dust. The putty that was smeared on the cracks of the woodshed window had already cracked and peeled off. Sang Sang looked at the shabby courtyard. A wet wind came from the back of the courtyard and instantly carried away all the dust in the house. The small courtyard suddenly became very clean. She pushed open the door of the woodshed. After thinking for a while, she did not go in. Instead, she turned into the bedroom and lay on the bed. Now she was no longer the daughter of Yama, and naturally did not need to hide from anyone. Cook more vegetables for dinner, she said. Ning Ke nodded and walked to the courtyard to prepare firewood for cooking. Looking at the lonely small tree, he was a little reluctant to do it. Where was the black crow on the branch? The stream behind the courtyard was still there, and there was still a tree by the stream. He chopped off enough wood with his palm and was about to leave when he suddenly saw a deep fist mark on a tree. Back then, he had to take care of Sang Sang, who was seriously ill, and always be on guard against the pursuit of the Buddhism and Taoism sects. He was always anxious and nervous. When he was about to give up, he went to the stream and wanted to vent his anger by punching the tree. However, he did not expect that his fist was so hard that it almost broke the tree. Looking at the fist mark on the tree, Ning Ke laughed. He was very happy that the tree was not broken, and he was also very happy that his fist mark was still there, because these were his most cherished memories. Just like the tree in the courtyard, and the black crow that had once landed on it. Piling the wood in the corner of the courtyard, he pushed open the bedroom door and walked to the bed. Looking at Sang Sang, who was sleeping soundly, he asked, "What do you want to eat? I'm not familiar with the produce of the Yueluan kingdom." Sang Sang opened her eyes, which were bright and clear, without any tiredness or sleepiness after waking up. Ning Ke had never understood what sleep meant to her. She thought for a while and said, "I'll go shopping with you." The two went to the market and bought a lot of vegetables. Then they went to the grocery store to buy rice, oil, salt, vinegar, pots and pans. They also bought a caddy of streaky pork and went home to make a sumptuous dinner. It was Ning Ke's job to carry the vegetables, cook and wash the dishes. During this process, Sang Sang just followed him with her hands behind her back. Sometimes she looked at him, and sometimes she looked at the sky. Ning Ke squatted in front of the basin and washed the dishes. He felt that this work was even harder than when he killed the horse gang. After a while he felt sore all over. Looking at Sang Sang at the door with her hands behind her back, he could not help but get annoyed. "I can't beat you now, so I'll just do more housework. It's fine if you don't want to help. Hao Qian, of course, is honorable. How can he be involved in such matters? It's fine if you just watch from the side, but can I trouble you with one thing? Can you not put your hands behind your back? He complained. You're like a leader inspecting your work. It hurts my enthusiasm. Sang Sang ignored him and walked into the room. She looked around with her hands behind her back and said, I want tea. God said let there be light, so there was light in the world. Sang Sang was the god of this world. If she said tea, there would be tea. She could make countless kinds of good tea. But for some reason, she wanted Ning Ke to buy them. Ning Ke was indeed a little tired but also happy, because he knew that Song Song's behavior proved that she had a deeper connection with the human world. She was becoming more and more like a human. That night, he knocked on the door of the largest tea house in Chaoyang City and bought 74 kinds of the most famous tea from each country with 2 taels of silver. At the same time, he packed several sets of expensive tea sets. After drinking tea for 3 days, Sang Sang suddenly said, I want to play chess. So Ning Ke searched everywhere for the best chess sets. But this time, it was more troublesome to satisfy Song Song's request, because chess always needed an opponent. You're too weak. Sang Sang looked at the white pieces on the chessboard and said to him, as a man, what he hated most was losing to his woman in chess or cards. Ning Ke was already in a bad mood at this time. Hearing this, he was even more annoyed. We lowly human beings are no match for the almighty Hao Tian. This was Song Song's most common evaluation of human beings. But it sounded bitter coming from his mouth. Song Song's expression didn't change. She said, human beings are indeed lowly, but some people are relatively better. Chen Pipi is much better than you in this aspect. As a man, what he really hated most was to be judged by his own woman as inferior to another man, even if that man was a good brother who had gone through thick and thin with him. Ning Ke said angrily, I can't get him from Linkhong City. Sang Sang said, then you have to think of another way. The next day, the 3 most famous chess players in Chaoyang City were invited to the small courtyard by Ning Quebec. Or rather, kidnapping was more appropriate. In addition to drinking tea, playing chess, and listening to plays, Ning Ke and Sang Sang would sometimes go to Chaoyang City to see the White Tower and walk by the lake. She still habitually put her hands behind her back. Dozens of days passed peacefully like this. They seemed to be looking for something in Chaoyang City, but in fact they were looking for nothing. They didn't ask where to go or what to do. They only asked what to eat the next day. One night, Ning Ke peeled a mangosteen and put the white kernel in front of Song Song's face. He laughed and said, doesn't this look like a butt? Sang Sang rarely showed any expression on her face. He had always been a little unwilling. This time he also failed. Sang Sang looked at him quietly for a long time. Suddenly she said, are we greedy? Ning Ke was silent for a moment. He put the mangosteen in his hand into her mouth. Then he walked to the courtyard and played a set of bladesmanship. He fetched some water from the stream and took a bath. He said, I'm going to sleep. Sang Sang sat by the table and looked at the tree outside the window. She didn't say anything. She used to want to return to Hao Yan's divine kingdom, because it was her mission. As long as she got rid of Buddha and killed Ning Ke, she could go back. But she and Ning Ke were born together. If Ning Ke died, she would die too. It would be Hao Yan who returned to the divine kingdom. She would no longer have the name Sang Sang. She would no longer be herself. She wanted to continue being herself. She wanted to continue having the name Sang Sang. What made her even angrier and more uneasy was that she actually wanted to continue living with him in the small courtyard like this. Green vegetables, fat meat, white rice, tea, and chess games were not a bad experience. So she didn't think about Buddha, the academy, Taoism, the divine kingdom, or the human world. As long as these days continued, she would continue to be herself, and she would continue to have him by her side. Yes, she was really greedy. Ning Ke once asked outside Chang'an, how can there be a perfect way in the world? I won't let Chang'an down or let you down. In fact, he knew that there was no such perfect way in the world. He was not afraid of death. He could actually threaten Sang Sang to go to Chang, and with suicide. And then the academy would use the God-stunning array to suppress her. Neither the Buddhism sect nor Taoism sect could do anything about it. But he was reluctant. So he took her to live in this small courtyard in Chaoyang City, ignoring what was happening in the human world. He didn't think about the academy or Buddha. He didn't think about anything. Yes, he was also very greedy. He was greedy for a moment of pleasure. After that night's conversation, Ning Ke and Sang Sang never talked about this again. The ordinary life in the human world went on peacefully. They had been in Chaoyang City for half a year, and the outside world had nothing to do with them. Chaoyang City was very lively after the beginning of spring. There were theaters everywhere. One evening, Ning Ke and Sang Sang returned from the theater. They bought half a pound of pig head meat on the street and had a simple dinner. Looking at the few pieces of pig head meat left in the bowl, Sang Sang suddenly said, "There's too little food." Ning Ke thought that no one would have the patience to cook a table full of food every day. He naturally changed the topic. "Cook something delicious tomorrow. By the way, did you like the play today?" Sang Sang stood up and walked out of the courtyard without any expression on her face. Ning Ke was slightly startled. He put the bowl and chopsticks into the basin, wiped the water on his hands and chased after her. Standing in the woods by the stream, she looked at the sky in silence with her hands behind her back. Ning Ke looked at the fist mark on the tree and found that it had become much fainter because of the regeneration of the bark in less than half a year. Naturally, it also looked much fainter. His mood became indifferent. Was he going to leave after all? Sang Sang said, "Being together doesn't mean being together." Ning Ke understood what she meant. After a moment of silence, he said, "Being together is because we should be together. It's not that I want to keep you in the human world in this way." Sang Sang did not speak for a long time. Ning Ke said, "You know what I'm thinking?" Sang Sang said, "Yes, I know what you're thinking. But it's still greed." Ning Ke looked at the side of her face and said, "Greed is not a sin." Sang Sang looked at the sky and said, "It's wrong." "What is greed?" "Love is greed. Because you like it, you will be greedy. Even a moment of greed in the human world is better than countless divine kingdoms. But a moment is too short after all. 4,000 words. I have already written 10,000 today. I will continue to write. My leader saw that I wrote it seriously, so she did not let me accompany her to walk the dog. I like this chapter but not the next one. I will go to eat now. The next chapter will definitely be late. Don't worry. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chitian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.